Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Mayor's Second Chance Bride, Book 2 of the Widows of Willow Brook Trilogy by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1, Willow Brook, Montana, 1878. Imogen opened the drapes at the window of her small bedroom and looked out across the rolling fields and distant hilly crags of High Bluff Ranch. Even though she had been living there for coming up to 3 months, it still gave her a jolt of surprise every morning. There was something so vast and wild about the landscape, in spite of where it had been tamed to be farmed. After years of living in New York with Horace, her first husband, followed by a stay with her sister Eleanor in Pittsburgh, the wide open spaces of Montana sure took some getting used to. Part of her missed the hustle and bustle of living in a busy town. She had liked the fact that a short walk in any direction would bring her to a well-manicured park where she could sit and watch folks strolling by. Or she could meet with friends in one of the new department stores to browse their latest fashions, followed by tea and cake for a friendly hour or two. There were no such conveniences now. Although High Bluff Ranch was not far out of the sleepy town of Willow Brook, it still required a buggy ride or for one of the ranch hands to saddle up Buttercup, the docile mare that she had been given on her arrival. "I need to stop thinking about the past," she muttered to herself. "I'm a ranchwoman now." It sounded strange on her tongue, as though she was trying it out for size. Who am I kidding? A wry smile curved her mouth. Imogen was nothing if not honest with herself, and she knew she still had a lot to learn before she would come close to being a ranchwoman. If it weren't for the fact that she had spent these last few months sharing the smaller log cabin on the ranch with her sister, Eleanor, and her 5-year-old nephew and niece, Isaac and Lily, Eleanor's twins, Imogen wasn't sure how she would have survived. It was the children's endless curiosity that was helping her slowly become accustomed to ranch life. They tugged her hand to go and stand near the corral and watch as the ranch hands wrangled cattle and trained the young colts to become working cattle horses. And in the languid, warm evenings, they persuaded her to come to the river while they dangled rods in, hoping to catch a fish in the still pools under the willow trees. Imogen sighed again as she thought back over her time in Montana so far, glancing at the small bundle of letters she kept on her dresser, tied up with a pink ribbon. Jeff Hayden, rugged rancher and new mayor hopeful for Willow Brook, had picked her to write to, after placing an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times with the help of Mrs. McKinnon's Two Hearts Entwined Matrimonial Bureau in Cottonwood Creek. She still could scarcely believe it. Even though Imogen liked to give the impression she was happy to make bold decisions, it had taken more courage than she cared to admit to consider taking a second husband. The memory of Horace's laziness and harsh behavior when he'd been drinking still made her shiver with fear if she allowed herself to think about it. But Jeff Hayden was different. His letters spoke of pride in his ranch and ambition to put Willow Brook on the map as a thriving frontier town. She sensed that he was well respected and enjoyed being busy. He epitomized everything that Horace wasn't. So when Jeff's proposal came after a few months of exchanging letters while she still lived in Pittsburgh, Imogen seized it with both hands. This was her much-longed-for second chance at love, she told herself, and anyone who would listen. She had whiled away the long and uncomfortable train journey west with Eleanor and their friend Fiona, marveling with their fellow travelers about how lucky she was. As she stepped down from the stagecoach on the dusty main street of Willow Brook, it was with excitement and hope in her heart. And when Jeff strode toward her with his broad shoulders, brown eyes, and confident smile, Imogen's last few doubts about being a mail-order bride vanished like mist burning off in the morning sun. He's everything I could possibly have wished for. That had been her first thought, and being next to him on the wagon ride home had certainly made her heart skip a beat when he turned his dazzling smile on her. Except it's not turning out how I hoped it would. And the worst thing is, I don't understand why, Imogen murmured, snapping back to the present. She stood at the window for a little bit longer, watching the ranch slowly coming to life outside. The sun had not been up for long, and the two ranch hands, Frank and Mervyn, emerged from the barn, where they slept in the loft above the animals. They yawned, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and buttoning up their cotton shirts before wandering around the back of the barn, where the nearest water pump was, for a wash. Her gaze traveled from the barn across the dusty yard to the main homestead. It was a large log cabin, silvered with age, which Jeff's pa, Henry Hayden, had built when he and his wife Jillian first claimed this land. A generous-sized veranda stretched along the front, built to make the most of a perfect view across the 300 acres, which comprised High Bluff Ranch, and to catch a cooling breeze on a hot day. The perfect place to sit with my husband and listen to how his day went, and make plans for our future. Imogen turned hastily from the window and saw in the mirror that her hazel eyes looked troubled, and there were shadows under them from the worries that kept her awake at night. The idea of sitting down and planning her future with Jeff seemed more out of reach with each day that passed, like a dream slipping through her fingers. To start with, he'd said he didn't want to rush her into getting married, so she would have time to get accustomed to being on the ranch. The small log cabin will be ideal for you and Eleanor to stay in, he had told her cheerfully when the wagon trundled up the drive. Pa built it for his ranch hand, Pedro, because he had 4 children, but he's long gone, and Frank and Mervyn are happier in the barn loft. Imogen had been happy to agree because she knew it wouldn't be for long. A week or 2 at most, and then Eleanor would have it all to herself. A roof over her head for her and the children, without having to pay any rent. Jeff was generous to provide for them, especially when he hadn't been obliged to. But then it transpired that Jillian, Jeff's mother, had recently suffered from a bout of pneumonia, which the doctor said had left her with a weak heart. I can't even think about getting married until Ma's better, he had told her a couple of weeks after her arrival. It would break her heart not to be able to help you organize everything, Imogen. You understand, don't you? I'm sure it won't be much longer. Imogen had agreed, of course. It would have looked mean-spirited to do otherwise, and she understood how precious Jeff was to Jillian. She and Henry had only been blessed with 1 child, and now that Henry had passed, Jeff was all that remained of Jillian's family. And yet, as the weeks turned to months, Imogen had a nagging feeling that there was more to it. In spite of her weak heart, Jillian was getting stronger every day. But whenever Imogen hinted about booking the pastor, Jeff would assure her it would be soon, without ever pinning down a specific date. Lately, she had even found herself wondering whether she would have been better off with Carl Ackhurst, the first man who she had been corresponding with after replying to his advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Except his letters suddenly stopped coming. She shook her head slightly. He had sounded ideal in his first few letters, and the coincidence of it was that he owned a block of land in Montana as well. Not far from Cottonwood Creek, he'd said, although he'd been vague about exactly where. Perhaps Jeff even knew of him, except she could hardly ask him. Otherwise, he would think he was second best. Even now, she was none the wiser about why Mr. Ackhurst's letters had come to an abrupt halt. She had continued writing, sending him 4 more letters and nursing her wounded pride a little more each time he failed to reply. But Imogen was not someone to give up on her second chance at love. And happily, Jeff's was the next advertisement she had spotted, and her hopes of marriage were revived. "Are you coming for breakfast?" Eleanor's voice pulled her out of her reverie, and Imogen hastily coiled up her hair. "Didn't Fiona look lovely at her wedding yesterday?" Eleanor said cheerfully when Imogen stepped into the kitchen a few minutes later. "Lovely," Imogen agreed, making an effort to smile. "I'm glad she liked the brooch we gave her. She and Abraham are so well suited, and now that the traveling judge gave his approval for them to care for Freddie and Gloria, it made the day perfect." and thank goodness their wretched uncle is safely behind bars. That robbery he committed at Abraham's bakehouse could have ended very differently if Fiona hadn't turned up in the nick of time. Imogen busied herself with making coffee, but she could feel the weight of Eleanor's concerned gaze on her. "Is everything all right with you this morning?" Eleanor asked as she set out some bowls on the table for porridge and then added a jug of milk. "You seemed kind of quiet last night when we came back from the wedding meal." Imogen knew there was no point trying to brush her sister's comment aside. Eleanor knew her too well. "It's just, I didn't expect Fiona and Abraham to get married before Jeff and me. I know it sounds petty, and I'm very happy for them both, but I guess it's just left me feeling a bit flat. I was the one with the marriage proposal, and we all came west so I could be with Jeff, but here I am, still single." Eleanor walked around the table and patted her shoulder to reassure her. "Jeff seemed to enjoy the day," she said. "If anything, seeing Fiona and Abraham getting wed and so delighted to be together might be a good thing. It will make Jeff realize what he's missing out on. Jillian has been quite energetic these last few days. I noticed she's back out doing some light chores in the garden." "I know," Imogen replied with a long sigh. "That's what I'm worried about. Jeff said he wanted to wait for his ma to get better, and at his last visit, Dr. Clary was pleased with her progress. Jillian told me herself, so I'm not quite sure what Jeff is still waiting for. It doesn't make sense. Perhaps he's not the confident person everyone thinks, and you just..." Isaac and Lily came running into the kitchen before Eleanor had a chance to finish the conversation. "Can we go and see the new calves today, Ma?" Isaac asked eagerly. "Will you come with us, Aunt Imogen?" "Don't forget about me," Lily said, nudging her twin brother. "Mervyn said that Mr. Hayden might let us start to ride soon." She hopped excitedly from one foot to the other. "We love living on a ranch, Aunt Imogen. It's much nicer than Pittsburgh. We're very glad that you and Mr. Hayden are getting married." "I am too, dear," Imogen said with a chuckle. "I reckon I should get Mervyn to give me some more lessons as well. Buttercup is very docile, but if I'm to be a rancher's wife, I need to be able to do more than just plod into town and back." "Maybe you should ask Jeff to teach you instead," Eleanor said, sprinkling a small spoonful of sugar over her porridge. She looked up at Imogen and lifted one eyebrow. Imogen gave her a small nod, feeling her spirits lift. Of course, that would be the ideal way to spend more time in Jeff's company. "That's a good idea. And I think I shall suggest we eat our meals together up at the homestead as well. Just because Jillian is feeling better, she shouldn't overexert herself by doing all the cooking for Jeff and the men." As the four of them sat down to breakfast and Imogen poured out 2 cups of coffee, she felt her resolve strengthen. Jeff did not seem like a dishonest man, and surely his marriage proposal was genuine because he had sent her money for her rail fare. But something is holding him back from getting married to me. Her mind churned over his puzzling behavior as she hastily ate her porridge. She needed to get to the bottom of his reluctance, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had to be smart about how she went about it. Jeff's worried I'm missing the comforts of Pittsburgh. He needs to see if I can adapt to ranch life. That must be it. All right. Now she was getting somewhere. She would throw herself into being the sort of wife she thought a rancher would want. This was her second chance at love, and she couldn't afford to allow herself to think that heading west had been a terrible mistake. No, she was determined to make it work. Jeff was handsome and worked hard, not to mention the flutter of butterflies she felt in her stomach when she was in his company. She knew they could have a happy marriage. She just needed to figure out why he wasn't allowing himself to see that too. Chapter 2. Jeff spat on his hands and rubbed them together before picking up his splitting maul and positioning a log on the chopping block. In one smooth movement, he brought the maul down onto the wood, splitting it neatly in 2. He reached for the next log and repeated the process. Crack! Crack! He grunted with the exertion. He eyed the woodpile and figured half a day might allow him to finish the cord of wood he'd already started a few days earlier if it didn't get too hot. The simple, rhythmical motion allowed his mind to wander freely, which he needed after attending Fiona and Abraham's wedding the previous day. Imogen hadn't needed to tell him that she was disappointed her friend was getting married before she and Jeff were. It had been written in her hazel eyes, and the way her bright smile had faded slightly when she thought nobody was looking. Jeff's muscles started to burn as he swung the maul faster in response to the way he felt about himself. The early morning sun crested the top of the nearby mountains, bathing him in golden light, and he gripped the wooden handle more firmly, not pausing to enjoy the birdsong as he normally would have done. What's wrong with me? She traveled across the country to marry me, and like a fool, I can't even bring myself to book the pastor. Sweat trickled into his eyes, and he swiped it away on the back of his hand, feeling a surge of annoyance that refused to leave, no matter how hard he worked. I wouldn't blame her if she turned around and headed straight back to Pittsburgh. The harsh thoughts rattled through his mind as he chastised himself. What are you chopping wood for, Jeff? Mervyn ambled toward him with a puzzled expression. Aren't there other, more important things to be getting on with today? I thought we were going to ride out and check the steers at the boundary. Surely Frank can take care of this for you? Jeff brought the maul down even more firmly, sending splinters of wood flying in every direction. I'm not the sort of boss who's afraid to get his hands dirty, he growled. Just because Frank is young doesn't mean he should get the menial jobs. Besides, I'll never expect one of my men to do something I'm not prepared to do myself first. He threw the freshly split wood onto the pile and reached for the next log, but then stopped as Mervyn placed his dusty boot on top of it before he could grab it. Frank and I would never think that of you, Mervyn said calmly. Do you want to tell me what this is really about? I heard you splitting wood like a crazy fella since long before sunup. Jeff felt the anger draining from him and dropped the maul into the dirt next to the chopping block. I just thought I'd get ahead on some jobs, that's all. He shrugged and ran a calloused hand through his thick brown hair. You know I like to be prepared. Just because it's summer now doesn't mean winter won't be here again soon enough. Mervyn's eyes narrowed in his weathered face. You're not fooling me that easily, boss. He strolled a few steps to the corral and lifted his foot to rest it on the bottom rail. An easy silence stretched between the two men as Mervyn watched the cattle in the nearest field, grazing contentedly. Remember when you were still a boy, and you told me you liked to chop wood to get things straight in your mind, he added casually, shooting him a sudden grin. I haven't forgotten that, son. Hard work can clear things in your head, but it can also act as a way to avoid facing them, depending on how you're feeling. Maybe it's something I could help you with? Jeff came to join Mervyn at the corral, and his gaze was pulled toward the small log cabin below his homestead before he could stop it. He had spotted Imogen standing looking out of her bedroom window earlier, although he'd stayed in the shadow of the woodshed, not wanting her to see him. Even from that distance, he had sensed her confusion, and knowing that it was him who was causing it had left a sour, curdled feeling in his stomach. We can see the steers later. What else are you up to today? He asked Mervyn, trying to change the subject. His ranch hand's bushy eyebrows twitched upward as he gave him an amused smile. Nice, try, Mervyn chuckled. How about I tell you what I'm up to after you've gotten whatever is bothering you off your chest? We don't need any more wood to be split, and you've only had half your mind on things lately. It ain't like you. Jeff smiled back despite himself. Mervyn had worked at High Bluff Ranch for almost 30 years. To start with, he had told Henry Hayden he was only passing through. Jeff could remember the tall, rangy man riding up the track on his paint horse with a bedroll on the back. He'd tipped his hat politely at Jillian and explained to Henry that he liked to stay on the move, but would be grateful for a few months' work to see him through to winter, when he would be on his way again. But all these years later, Jeff knew High Bluff Ranch wouldn't be the same without Mervyn. He suspected the man stayed because he had a soft spot for his ma, and he wanted to protect her when I was still too young to know what was happening. The thought slipped into Jeff's mind unbidden. Mervyn was a good 20 years older than him, but you'd never know it other than the limp which bothered him during cold weather and the peppering of gray hair at his temples. He was the best hired hand in the district, with a calm demeanor when he was working the animals, and loyal with it. In many ways, Jeff looked upon Mervyn as the father figure he'd never had. The sort of father I wish Pa had been, more like. "So, are you going to spit it out this side of Christmas?" Mervyn's eyes crinkled with amusement again as he waited patiently. "It's nothing. Just a few things to think about since going to Fiona and Abraham's wedding yesterday, that's all," he finally muttered. Mervyn nodded slowly. "Uh-huh? I figured it might be something to do with that." He bent down and picked a long blade of grass, sticking it in the corner of his mouth. "You're nothing like your father, you know," he said firmly. "You're a different sort of man altogether, Jeff. Just because you came from him doesn't mean you'll act like him." "It's easy for you to say that," Jeff said hotly. He could hear a rough edge in his voice because it mattered so much. But Mervyn wasn't rattled. He understood why. "How will I know?" Jeff continued. "I mean, I've never been married before, so what if I don't find out until it's too late? Son, you've got to have a little faith in yourself." Mervyn rested his gnarled hand on Jeff's shoulder for a moment in a friendly gesture of support. Even though Jeff wasn't his son, he'd never had children. The comforting phrase often slipped out when they were alone. God knows Jeff had needed a bit of comfort over the years, Mervyn often thought. A friend to turn to when Henry Hayden had been raging and cussing and quick to use his fists to keep his wife and son in their place. Not that other folks in the district ever realized what Mr. Hayden Sr., the successful rancher and upstanding pillar of the community, was really like when he was at home, out of sight of the neighbors. "Ma says that Pa only ever got like it when things were a struggle on the ranch," Jeff muttered, kicking his boot in the dust. Even though his pa had died many years ago, he couldn't help but glance around the yard out of habit. Henry had liked to creep up and catch him doing something wrong, just to give him the excuse to vent his anger. And Jeff sometimes wondered whether his spirit lurked still, never quite letting him forget about the past. "Plenty of ranchers go through bad times and manage to curb their temper," Mervyn observed mildly. "He was a good man until he was up against bad weather or a failed crop. Then he couldn't help himself from turning to drink and taking it out on us." "Well, it looks to me like you take it out on the wood splitting if things are troubling you," Mervyn said lightly. "That's the sign of a man who is determined not to take on the worst parts of his pa, if you ask me. Besides, there's more of your mother in you than you realize. And Jillian is a kind-hearted woman, always has been." Jeff shot the man a smile, grateful for the reminder. Sometimes he got so wrapped up in trying not to be like Henry Hayden that he forgot that his ma was his kin as well. "I feel like a bit of a fool, now you say that." He glanced toward the small log cabin again, smiling as he saw Imogen bustle outside, holding Lily's hand, to peg something on the washing line. "I guess I can see that I've been using Ma's illness as an excuse to wait a while and get to know Imogen a bit better." "There's nothing wrong with that," Mervyn replied. He chewed the end of the blade of grass and then pushed himself away from the corral railings. "But it's been nearly 3 months, Jeff. If you're not careful, you're going to lose Imogen. She seems like a spirited sort of woman who won't take kindly to being left dangling without answers." "I know." Jeff felt the shame curdle in his stomach again. "She deserves better." He brightened and reached for his hat. "I'm going to talk to her later today and get everything straightened out. And not just about the wedding either. There's something else I need to ask her as well." "Would this happen to be about putting your name forward to be the mayor of Willow Brook?" Jeff wondered why Mervyn sounded doubtful. "Uh-huh. I thought she'd like it. Makes me sound more respectable, don't you think?" "Son, you don't need fancy titles to impress her." Mervyn grinned as he unhitched the corral gate to fetch the horses in. "I've seen the way she looks at you. I reckon she'll love you just as you are. Don't go making things more complicated than they need to be." Jeff nodded, but as he picked up the maul again, he knew in his heart he couldn't agree. Everyone else in the district thought Henry Hayden had been a good man, but Jeff knew differently. Henry, his pa, had been cruel and thoughtless to Jillian for years. And that was what lay at the heart of Jeff's sudden fear now that Imogen was here. What if I turn out just like him? What if I can't stop myself from being cruel to Imogen one day when she least expects it? And she looks at me the way Ma used to look at Pa, with fear in her eyes. I don't think I could bear it. He felt the pleasant ache of hard work in his shoulder muscles as he started splitting logs again, allowing his mind to turn over everything that had been troubling him. Imogen, with her glossy dark curls and bewitching hazel eyes, had taken his breath away when he met her off the stagecoach. She was smart and interesting. She was elegant and kind. She was too good for him. He stopped abruptly, trying to take in that thunderbolt of self-awareness. That's what it came down to. He was afraid he would ruin everything, even though he yearned to take her in his arms. He had been distant with her, not trusting himself, which he could see was hurting her. What would people think if they knew what was going on in my mind, huh, Bluey? He smiled ruefully at his faithful dog, who was sitting alertly, waiting for him to finish so they could get out to the fields. The dog's tail sent up an eddy of dust as he wagged at the sound of his master's voice. A sudden movement out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. It was Imogen, walking toward him, looking purposeful. He liked the way her hips swung slightly and how small tendrils of hair framed her face where they had escaped from the bun under her sunbonnet. I was wondering if you would like me to bring you a cup of coffee?" she asked hesitantly. "It looks like you've already been working for hours. I feel a little guilty for not getting up earlier, but I guess I was tired after all the excitement of Fiona's wedding yesterday." Jeff put his maul down again and straightened up. "A coffee would be nice, and maybe you could have one too, and we could sit on the veranda for a few minutes." "Oh, yes, I'd like that very much." Imogen caught his eye and then glanced quickly away again as though she hadn't expected him to suggest spending time together. It only served to show him how offhand he must have been behaving toward her. "I like to get plenty of wood chopped during the summer. Sometimes the weather can change almost overnight when we go into fall, and I don't like to be caught out. The homestead is cozy when the fire is lit, and there's a storm howling outside, you'll see." "The main log cabin, you mean?" Jeff saw hope flare in Imogen's eyes at his comment. "Uh-huh," he said, stepping a little closer to her. He felt his heart beat a little faster as the corners of her mouth lifted in a smile. It made him realize suddenly that he wanted to bring her happiness because it felt good to him as well, which made it all the more important to pick his words carefully. "I've been thinking about booking the pastor for our wedding. Have you?" A faint pink flush rose up Imogen's cheeks as she realized she might have sounded too eager, which Jeff found rather endearing. "Your ma did mention that Dr. Clary was pleased with her progress. Perhaps she would like to help me with the planning. Not that it needs to be a grand affair," she added hastily. "I think she would really like that," Jeff said cautiously. "I'll probably be heading into town at the end of the week, so I'll call in and see the pastor to find out when he might be free." Imogen nodded and glanced away, blinking rapidly. Jeff wondered whether she was close to tears and felt wretched. He had to explain, but it was hard to break the habit of a lifetime. "If you ever tell a soul about this, I'll take it out on your ma." That's what Henry had often growled at him. Jeff could still remember his father's threat the first time he'd tried to stand up to him, calling him a bully for the fresh bruise he'd caught sight of on his ma's shoulder one day before she hastily covered it up with her shawl. Jeff had kept his pa's secret. Only Jillian and Mervyn knew what a brute he was, or how close they had come to losing the ranch because of his drinking. And for as long as he could remember, Jeff had vowed to himself that he would be better than Henry Hayden and make a success of his life. "Dear Lord, please give me the strength to grow the ranch bigger and raise the best animals, so I won't ever be like Pa." That had been his nightly prayer ever since Henry had gotten swept away in the river in a flash flood. But if he was going to make a success of his marriage as well as his ranch, he owed Imogen the truth, at least what he could bring himself to share of it. "I was thinking about trying to improve my horse riding," Imogen began. "Would you like to join me in checking the steers?" Jeff blurted out. They both laughed as they talked over each other, feeling shy but also sensing a small shift in the distance that had been growing between them. I was going to ask if you might have time to teach me to ride Buttercup a bit better, Imogen said. I want to be able to help you on the ranch, not just plod into town. I guess that's a good place to start, Jeff said. He nodded. I'll saddle her up. Come out in an hour, and I'll show you a bit more of the place. He watched as Imogen hurried away with a spring in her step. But even though he knew he had to tell her more about his past, he didn't relish the idea. There were things he'd done that he wasn't proud of, things which might catch up with him, that even Mervyn and his ma didn't know about. Should I tell her everything? The thought troubled him as he tidied away his tools and went to wash up under the water pump. Perhaps he was more like his pa than he wanted to admit, although Jeff had always chosen to justify his ruthless streak as being for the good of the ranch. The cold water made him gasp, and he decided that it would be best to tell Imogen what she needed to know, and perhaps not anymore. Just until they had gotten to know each other better. Chapter 3. Let me help you up onto Buttercup, Jeff said. He had the 2 horses saddled and waiting, and looked slightly impatient as though he was already regretting his invitation. Imogen hesitated for a moment and then nodded. Usually she scrambled into the saddle herself or used the corral rail to help herself up. But the feeling of Jeff's hands resting lightly around her waist was something she had been hoping for over the last few weeks. Although his touch was respectful, it made her heart skip a beat nonetheless. Thank you. She hid a small smile under the pretext of leaning forward to pat Buttercup on her neck once she had settled into the saddle. There was something about Jeff's rugged face and broad shoulders that made her feel as giddy as a young woman experiencing first love, and it was multiplied even more now that he finally seemed to be opening up to her and behaving more attentively. It was what she had been wishing for ever since arriving in Willow Brook, but lately she had started to fear it might never happen. You're doing pretty well, considering you'd never even gotten onto a horse before you arrived. Jeff waited until she had picked up her reins before getting onto Marty, his sturdy bay gelding. Mervyn has been very patient with me, Imogen said, wanting to credit the ranch hand. And he's been kind with Eleanor's children as well, she added. They struggled to come to terms with losing their pa, Jacob, when he was killed in the railroad riots last year, but being here on the ranch has done them the world of good. I'm glad to hear it, Jeff replied, smiling happily. I reckon some folks from back east must think that living on a ranch is a dull way of life, but I believe it's good for children to grow up close to nature. Learning how to care for animals and living by the seasons is God's way. Imogen shifted on her saddle until she was comfortable, and then adjusted her bonnet to shade her face from the hot sun. It was very generous of you to offer Eleanor and the twins the small cabin. I would have missed them so much if they were still in Pittsburgh. It's nice to see children here, Jeff said with a small shrug. There's nobody else using the place, so it made sense. He opened the corral gate and led the way out. As the horses ambled forward side by side along the track and then into the first field, Imogen wondered whether Jeff regretted the fact that he had no children. He had never said anything to imply it, but in Imogen's experience, most men wanted the family name to continue, especially if there was a business to hand on to the next generation. Do I dare ask him? Maybe that's why he's been distant with me. The worries filled her head again, distracting her from what was meant to be a pleasant outing. Now that she was in her late 30s, she knew there was a very real chance that she might not be able to bear children for him, but they had never really spoken about it. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, in case it turned out he was regretting his marriage proposal. They rode on in silence for a while, and she glanced at him sideways every now and again. He was more attractive than ever outside. A strong, masculine man, the sort she had never imagined might want her as a wife. His tousled brown hair and dark eyes sent a thrill through her every time she was near him. But he still felt like a closed book to her. What was going on in his mind? Why had he been avoiding her? She couldn't help but feel as though there was a terrible secret he was keeping from her. And she knew if he couldn't share his innermost thoughts with her, she might never experience the closeness she had yearned for since answering his advertisement. Maybe he's shy, and needs some encouragement from me." It seemed improbable. Everyone in Willow Brook spoke about how confident and successful Jeff was, but Imogen figured anything was better than this strained silence that had appeared again. "Tell me a little more about your land," Imogen started. It sounded awkward to her ears, but she persisted. "I have to confess, I found all the wide open space a bit overwhelming when I first arrived, but now I'm getting used to it. The views are so beautiful. You must be very proud of everything you have here." A shadow crossed Jeff's face, which surprised Imogen. It was almost as though he seemed guilty, or perhaps troubled by something. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it hinted that the way he felt about High Bluff Ranch was not quite as straightforward as she had assumed. "The original ranch was not this size," Jeff explained. "When my pa and ma first came here, he claimed just over 100 acres and slowly built up a small herd of cattle. Our boundary ended over there." He pointed toward a dip in the land where a wooden fence kept some young steers enclosed. "It's not the best land in the district," he continued. "The fertile plains further down the river valley on the other side of town are best for crops around here. But what we lost out on with that, we gained with the spring pastures up yonder, by the mountains. And the land closer to the homestead is plenty good enough for growing wheat and to provide hay for our winter feeding." The horses fell into a steady lope as they entered a new field that opened up before them, and Imogen felt herself starting to relax and enjoy his company. Buttercup's gait was smooth and not too fast, so she felt surprisingly secure in the saddle even though she had never gone as fast before. "Are you racing me?" Jeff called across to her with a glint of amusement in his eyes. "I can see you've taken to this like a natural horsewoman." "It's all down to Buttercup looking after me," she replied, laughing at the sense of freedom it gave her. The crowded streets of Pittsburgh seemed like a distant memory, and she was starting to understand what Jeff meant when he told her he would never leave the place. "And how big is the ranch now?" she asked a moment later as the horses slowed to a more sedate pace again. A pair of buzzards wheeled high above them in the sky, and she reined Buttercup to a halt so she could watch. There was something majestic about the birds as they coasted higher and higher in the warm air, barely flapping their wings to stay up there. "It's just over 300 acres now," Jeff replied. "I didn't realize your pa was so ambitious." "It was down to me, not him." A shadow clouded Jeff's expression again. "I need to explain a bit about what my pa was really like," he added awkwardly. He met her eye very briefly and looked away again quickly as though he didn't really want to talk about it. "You don't have to say if it makes you feel uncomfortable." She wanted to know more about Jeff's past, but not if it was going to spoil the friendly moment that had unexpectedly blossomed between them. "No, I have to." Jeff's reply was forceful, and Imogen shivered in spite of the hot sun, wondering why his mood had suddenly changed. She reached across and touched his arm briefly. "Your letters shared a lot about the ranch and Jillian, but you never mentioned your pa." Jeff's lip curled in contempt for a second, which took her aback. "My pa, Henry Hayden, was very well respected around these parts. Folks saw him as a successful rancher, raising good cattle, and always ready with a smile and an encouraging word when he was in town. But that's not what he was like at home." Imogen nodded, trying to keep the surprise from showing on her face. She didn't reply immediately, wanting to say the right thing. "That must have been hard for you," she said eventually. "Uh-huh. We lived a lie, which was difficult. The worst thing was seeing how he treated Ma. The bruises she tried to hide from me, the way she tied herself up in knots trying to keep him happy. Not that anything she did would have been good enough for him when he was in that frame of mind. Mervyn did his best to make sure it never went too far." I'm sorry, Jeff. I had no idea." Imogen thought about Jillian, who was always cheerful and stoically accepted her ailments and the fact that she was getting old. Jeff's ma seemed so gentle. It was shocking to think her husband had hit her in anger. He used to take his belt to me as well, and later his fists. They rode quietly onward and came to the brow of a hill where Jeff stopped. He jumped down from Marty and then came and held Buttercup's reins so Imogen could dismount. "Thank the Lord, Mervyn was here and able to help you." Mervin's a good man, the sort of person I wish Ma had married. Jeff gestured to their surroundings. This here is my favorite part of the ranch, he said gruffly. I can understand why. It's beautiful. As the horses started grazing, she followed Jeff to a spinney of aspen trees that stood at the top of the hill, and she gasped as she saw the vista in front of them. There was a gully just ahead with a tumbling river running through it. Unlike the river closer to the homestead, which meandered through the grassland, this one had carved a path down the side of the mountain and was surrounded by scree and rocks. Beyond it, the land looked wilder, as yet unclaimed. The base of the mountain was thickly wooded, with the occasional clearing, which she assumed might be the spring grazing meadows Jeff had mentioned. Imogen took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air and smiled, shaking her head in amazement. I never imagined I could feel so free in a place like this. Thank you for bringing me here. I love it. Her smile faltered as she realized Jeff was still deep in thought about his past. I used to ride up here to escape Pa when things were particularly bad, Jeff said quietly. I tried to stick up for Ma, he added, looking pained. Nobody ever knew what he was really like, you see, apart from Mervyn. He saw Pa for who he really was, but everyone else thought he was the salt of the earth. When I got old enough, I tried to protect Ma, even tried to fight him off and threatened to tell the sheriff. He shook his head and scowled. That didn't deter him. Pa said that if I ever spoke about this with anyone, he would take it out on Ma even more. How did it end? Imogen looked into Jeff's face, seeing the pain etched deep. I have Mervyn to thank for that. One day, when Pa was being worse than usual, Mervyn pinned him to the barn and told him that if he didn't stop, he would take the law into his own hands. Then a week later, we had a terrible storm, and Pa went out to check on some animals after he'd been drinking. He was swept away in this river and drowned. Jeff darted a worried look toward her, as though waiting to see repulsion or judgment in her eyes. I'd like to say I'm sorry he died, but I'm not. It was a relief. That probably makes me a bad son, but it's the truth. Imogen felt a surge of empathy for Jeff and stepped closer. I know what that must have felt like, she said softly. She took a deep breath. My first husband, Horace, behaved in the same way. Eleanor had some idea that he was like that, but I never really told anyone else. He treated you badly? Jeff glowered angrily and then shook his head. You didn't deserve that, Imogen, just like Ma didn't. Imogen felt her breath catch in her throat as Jeff suddenly placed his hands gently on her shoulders and looked deep into her eyes. There's something else I need to tell you. He swallowed and searched for the right words. I've always been afraid that because Pa treated Ma badly, I might turn out like him, even though I vowed to myself I wouldn't be. I told myself the only way to make sure was not to get married. But you can't live alone because of what your Pa was like. Jeff shrugged with sadness in his eyes. I know, but you must have wondered why I've never been married. I threw myself into working the land and raising my animals, and it worked for a while, but I didn't figure on it being a lonesome way to live. Eventually, Ma persuaded me to write the advertisement for the Matrimonial Times, but I still never really believed I would end up with a fiancé as beautiful as you. Imogen lifted her hands and placed them on Jeff's chest, feeling his heart beating beneath them. Now everything made sense, and she felt a wave of relief rush through her. It's not because he doesn't like me. It's not because he's disappointed and wants to change his mind. I've seen the way you are with your Ma and with Isaac and Lily. I don't believe you have it in you to behave the way your Pa did, she said firmly. Thank you. It's kind of you to say that. I rushed into marrying Horace before I really knew much about him, but now I'm a bit older and wiser, and dare I say it, a better judge of character. I honestly don't think you need to worry about turning out like your father. A moment of understanding passed between them. They were bound by a common sadness in their respective pasts, and Imogen knew it had taken a lot for him to admit all of this to her. Folks might say they understand what happened to you and to me as well, but if they haven't experienced it, how can they? Jeff ventured a rueful smile. I know, and I'm sorry you and your Ma had to go through that. But I do believe it doesn't define who you are now, Jeff. Truly, you're not your father, If anything, you'll guard your temper more because of seeing what he did." She watched his face closely, glad to see his expression change from anxiety to acceptance and even happiness. There was a new light in his brown eyes and softness in his face which hadn't been there before. "That's what Mervyn told me this morning," he said a moment later with a small laugh. "Between him and you, I reckon you both might be right. It's time for me to step out from my pa's shadow and make my own way in life." The horses snickered as Imogen nodded, and they both laughed again. It was as if the horses were agreeing. "That's what I did when I answered your advertisement. After Horace died, for a while, I thought I would never marry again, but then I figured the Lord only gives us one life, so I should get on and live it." "Huh? You reckon? Now you mention it, that's not a bad way of looking at things." Jeff gave her an admiring look. "I like your straightforward way of speaking about what's on your mind, Imogen. Eleanor says I can be rather outspoken," she said dryly. "I'm sorry it's taken me these last few months to get comfortable with the idea of actually getting married. I didn't want to behave dishonorably, but I guess I just lost my nerve. I was afraid of turning out like Pa, and I didn't want to disappoint you." "You disappoint me?" Imogen's mouth gaped open, and then she threw back her head and laughed louder than ever. "And all this time I thought I was disappointing you," she said, shaking her head. "No, nothing could be further from the truth. You're beautiful and smart, Imogen. More than I could have wished for." This time it was Jeff's turn to shake his head. Imogen felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "So, now that we've cleared the air, can we spend a bit more time together?" she asked hesitantly. "I know you're busy with the ranch, but I'd like to cook meals for you all in the main homestead. I don't want to take Jillian's place, but if you think she would agree with it, I'd be happy to take on her chores. It would be nice for us all to eat together in the homestead, but I'll understand if you don't want me to do that until after the wedding." "I think Ma would be more than happy," Jeff said. "And I give you my word, I'll go into Willow Brook at the end of the week and book the pastor for our wedding. You're a very understanding woman, and I'm glad you've been patient enough to wait these last few months. It's all right." Imogen felt she could afford to be forgiving now that she understood what lay behind Jeff's initial reluctance. "I spoke with lots of other mail-order brides on the journey out west. It's not so unusual to wait a few weeks for folks to get accustomed to their new lives before the wedding. Although maybe not 3 months," she thought to herself. "Mervyn told me if I wasn't careful, I would lose you. But that's the last thing I would want." For the first time since arriving in Willow Brook, Imogen felt a real sense of connection to Jeff, her fiancé, her future husband. All the fears that had been bubbling up in her heart over the last few weeks started to subside. There might still be tough times ahead, and it would be naive to imagine everything would be easy and simple from then on. She knew only too well that Henry's cruel behavior toward Jeff when he was younger might still cast a long shadow even after all these years. But at least now she understood more about him, and that was good enough for her. "We can work through it together." She smiled up at him, hoping they might at last kiss. But just as Jeff was lowering his head to meet her lips, a strange sound made her jump with fright. Chapter 4. The sudden sound of frightened bawling snatched Jeff's attention away, and he frowned, letting her go. He strode to the edge of the gulch and peered over, and she hurried after him. There below them, she spotted a small calf scrabbling in the loose scree, and just beyond it, a cow bellowed. Oh, the poor thing. Imogen's eyes filled with tears as the calf bawled again. It must be terrified. The edge of the tumbling river was only a few yards beyond, and she had a horrifying image of the creature being swept away. "I'm not sure what they're doing over here. I try to keep them away from this river, but maybe the fence has broken somewhere." Jeff shook his head, eyeing up the steep slope beneath their feet. It was slick from spray from the river and would be slippery. The calf must have gotten over the edge, and its maw followed. "We're going to need to work together, and quickly, to rescue them." "Shall I ride back and fetch Mervyn?" "No, there's no time for that. One wrong step and the calf will fall into the river. If the cow gets distressed, she might even try and go in after him, and I'd hate for that to happen. Reckon you're up to helping me?" Imogen felt herself begin to shake, but quickly took a steadying breath. Wasn't that what she wanted? To help her husband on the ranch. Of course, just tell me what to do, and with the Lord's grace, we'll figure it out. She smiled nervously and wiped her hands on her dress. Jeff shot her a grateful look, then hurried to fetch Marty, backing him up toward the gulch. He grabbed his lasso and quickly tied the end of it to the horn of his saddle. I'm going to rope the calf, but I need you to stand here with Marty and then walk him forward when I tell you. Don't worry, he knows what he's doing, but it's easier if you can help because I won't be able to see him from down below. Are you going down into the gulch? Is that safe? Imogen felt a ripple of alarm, fighting back the thought of Jeff being dragged into the fast-flowing water if the calf panicked. It's the only way. With the two of us, plus Marty, we can haul the calf back up the bank. His words were terse, but she knew it was only because he cared for his animals so much. What about her? Imogen asked, looking at the lumbering Hereford cow, which bellowed again. Her heart went out to it. Just like any mama, the cow was worried about her baby. She'll find a route back. Don't you worry about her. As soon as she sees the calf coming up, her instinct will be to follow. You'll be surprised how agile they can be, he added with a grin. Are you ready? Ready, Imogen shot back with a decisive nod. She wondered briefly what Eleanor would have thought if she could see them now, and felt a bubble of laughter rise up in her chest, which was from nerves as much as anything. Lord, please let me do this right, she muttered. A moment later, Jeff spun the lasso over his head and sent it flying over the edge of the gulch, where it sailed down and landed expertly around the calf's neck. With one flick of his wrist, he tightened the rope before the calf even knew what was happening. Then he leaned backward, taking up the slack. Easy, little one, easy. I'm not going to hurt you. Jeff slid down the scree, talking calmly all the while to the two animals to reassure them. We'll have your baby out in no time, Mama. The cow snorted a warning and pawed the ground as the calf bucked and tried to fight against the rope, bawling again. It's all right, girl. He's not going to come to any harm. Imogen could feel slick sweat on her palms as her heart raced. From her position above, the slope looked almost vertical, but she didn't dare cry out in case it alarmed the animals even more. Just as her nerves were stretched to breaking point, she noticed that the cow seemed to be calming down at the sound of Jeff's voice. And the calf stopped struggling, just standing there trembling on its spindly legs instead. Once she saw that Jeff had reached the calf, she hurried back to Marty's head and held his reins. I'm ready now. Jeff's voice floated up to her over the steady roar of the river. Lead Marty slowly forward, and I'll push the calf up ahead of me. Taking a deep breath, Imogen looked into the gelding's kind brown eyes and nodded, even though she knew Jeff couldn't see her. She felt a bond between her and the horse as his nostrils flared, ready to do what he was trained for. All right, I'm starting now. Imogen clicked her tongue and rubbed Marty's neck. Let's go, boy. We can do this. The rope strained as she eased him forward a couple of steps, and she watched as it inched over the top of the gully, praying it wouldn't fray on a rock. Keep going. You're both doing great. Every second felt like an hour as Marty's muscular flanks bunched with exertion, and she encouraged him to keep walking forward. She could hear the calf scrabbling on the scree and rocks skittering down the slope into the river. But just when she was starting to doubt they would manage, the calf suddenly appeared at the lip of the gulch. First its head, then its chest. She could see Jeff had his shoulder against its back legs, and then, like a cork coming out of a bottle, with one last heave, the calf popped over the top of the bank and stood on the grass, trembling on shaky legs and looking dazed and confused. Panting, Jeff leaped over the edge as well, with a happy grin. You did it, he called. Stand back. Here comes his maw. Much to Imogen's surprise, the cow suddenly appeared over the top of the gulch about 20 yards away and came trotting toward them, her udder swinging. Jeff hastily loosened the lasso from around the calf's neck and grinned again as it ran toward the cow, looking none the worse for its ordeal. Look how happy she is to see him. Imogen blinked back tears of relief as the calf butted the cow's udder and started suckling milk as though nothing had happened. You saved them, Jeff. You're amazing. It's nothing, And besides, I couldn't have done it without you." Jeff looked momentarily embarrassed, as though he wasn't used to receiving so much praise. But it could have ended very differently. Thank the Lord, they seemed to be all right. "So, how did you like your first job on the ranch? Helping rescue one of my best animals. Wait until Mervyn and Frank hear about this. They were worried you might not like ranch life, but this shows you'll make the perfect rancher's wife," he exclaimed. "I loved it. Thank you for letting me help you." Imogen felt a surge of pure joy in her heart at Jeff's words as the two animals wandered away. The whole thing had been over in less than half an hour, but she would never forget this day. It was the first time she had sensed that there was a proper future for her and Jeff together as husband and wife, and she felt the sudden need to give thanks for the miraculous event. "Thank you, God, for helping us save the cow and her calf," she murmured. "And for this new connection between Jeff and me," she added silently in her head. The prayer brought genuine happiness to Imogen as she watched Jeff untie the rope from Marty's saddle. "You did well, Marty," Jeff crooned to the horse, scratching his neck affectionately. "And you did as well," Imogen said lightly. She took her bonnet off and shook her curls out, enjoying the cooling breeze after so much tension. She felt a blush creep up her cheeks again as she realized Jeff was watching her with a strange expression. Their eyes locked, and this time, without a moment's hesitation, Jeff strode toward her and brushed a kiss on her lips that left her wanting more. "Thank you for everything you've done today," he said softly. "Not just helping me with the calf, but letting me tell you about my past as well." He coughed, suddenly remembering that they were unchaperoned and not married yet. "Shall we ride back now? Mervyn might be wondering where we've gotten to." Imogen sighed happily as she walked over to Buttercup, and Jeff lifted her into the saddle, letting his hands linger for a bit longer on her waist this time. There was more to her fiancé than she had ever imagined, but now she felt hopeful for their future. She hadn't made a mistake coming to Willow Brook to be with Jeff Hayden after all. As they rode back towards the homestead, Imogen felt more content than she had for weeks. It was only after this breakthrough that she realized how despondent she had been feeling about her situation, assuming the worst and thinking that Jeff had regretted his proposal. But now, as she watched him sitting easily in his saddle on Marty just ahead of her, she was able to enjoy the sunshine on her shoulders and the breeze on her face with uncomplicated pleasure. They had spotted the place where the fence had broken, and Jeff made a hasty repair that would do for the time being until he could return with more tools to fix it better. "The children said that Mervyn might teach them to ride soon," she called. "They love being here on the ranch, Jeff. And Eleanor is very happy to see her future in Montana as well. It sure is a good place for them to grow up. While we're thinking about plans for the future, there's something else I'd like to talk to you about." Jeff reined Marty in so he could ride next to Imogen and gave her a sideways look. "It's something that's been on my mind for a while, but I want to make sure you're happy with it too." That sounds intriguing. She felt flattered that her opinion mattered. It boded well for their marriage. A sudden memory of Horace telling her in a fit of anger that she was too opinionated and that whatever he wanted was all she should care about slid into her mind. She was glad that Jeff was different. "I'm sure I will be happy about it," she added. Jeff cleared his throat, looking almost nervous. Until recently, Willow Brook never had its own mayor. I guess the town was too small, but thankfully that changed about 5 years ago. Mayor Castleman has held the position for the last 2 years, but since his wife died, his heart hasn't really been in it. He told me he's thinking about taking the railroad to Wyoming to live with his daughter and her family. Too many painful memories for him here. That's understandable. Imogen had a feeling she knew where the conversation was heading, and she raised her eyebrows. "I remember you mentioned something to do with this in one of your letters. Are you going to put yourself forward to be considered?" "I would like to," Jeff said with a nod. "At least, it was my dream before you came west. It will take up a fair bit of my time on top of working the ranch. Not every wife would be happy with that." He glanced sideways at her again. "I don't want you to feel as though my work is more important. Not after you've traveled all the way here." They rode on in silence for a little while, as Imogen gave it fair consideration. "I get the feeling that you want to improve Willow Brook," she said eventually. The horses filed through a gateway, and Jeff leaned over Marty's neck to secure the gate shut again before they continued along the dusty, rutted track. "That's it exactly," Jeff replied. His eyes shone with enthusiasm. "I know the town is small now, and it won't be as grand as the ones where the railroad passes through. But that's no excuse for us not to take pride in the place. There are more folks settling here than ever. The school will need to expand. We'll get more businesses springing up. I really think Willow Brook deserves to be more than just a sleepy town that folks pass through on their way to somewhere better." "I admire your ambition for the town." Imogen thought about the first impressions she had of it when they'd stepped down off the stagecoach. Although some folks might say that the quaintness of Willow Brook is part of its charm. It would be sad to lose that if the town grew too fast, don't you think? She wondered whether she had been too outspoken as a small frown furrowed Jeff's brow. But her fears were allayed as he pushed his hat back and scratched his head before nodding again. "You might be onto something there," he said excitedly, looking at her with newfound respect. "You're right. We don't just want Willow Brook to be like every other frontier town. If we can find a way to retain its quaint feel and still expand at a steady pace in a way that the locals and old-timers can support, I think folks would like that." He shook his head and grinned. "We sure make a good team, huh?" Imogen felt another dart of happiness. "I guess being the mayor is the best way to lead folks around to that way of thinking. So you agree?" Jeff shot her a warm smile. "I'll let Mayor Castleman know straight away." He hesitated for a moment. "I don't think anyone else is putting themselves forward for it, so I might be able to take up the position within a few weeks. Would you be very upset if the pastor wasn't able to marry us until after that has been sorted out?" For a moment, Imogen's heart sank. Is this just another excuse? The thought hit her like a cloud crossing the sun, taking the brightness out of the day. But then she remembered the sense of restrained passion in Jeff's broad chest under her hands, and the softness in his eyes when he had kissed her. "I guess what I'm saying is that I don't want the wedding to be overshadowed by my becoming mayor," Jeff said hastily, looking worried. "But we can still book a date with the pastor, so you know I meant it when I said I want you to be my wife, and soon." Relief washed over her again, and she realized she needed to stop thinking the worst. It wasn't a ploy to delay the wedding. "I want to support you, Jeff. Whichever comes first doesn't matter as long as we're together. I sure did get lucky having you reply to my advertisement. As for it taking up more of your time, I expect there will be things I can help you with. In fact, if you don't mind, I would like to be involved in your work and improving Willow Brook because this is my home now, and our future is here." "I was just about to come looking for you," Mervyn hollered as he walked around the corner of the barn and caught sight of them. Jeff and Imogen shared a smile, and she knew he was pleased that she supported his ambitions to become mayor. There would be plenty of time later to talk about it more if they needed to. "A calf got stuck in the gulch, and the cow went down after him." Mervyn looked alarmed and strode toward his saddle, which was on the fence rail. "Want me to ride up and sort it out, boss?" He whistled to catch his horse's attention in the corral. "No need." Jeff shook his head with a chuckle. "Imogen already did it with a bit of help from Marty and me." "She did?" Mervyn's eyebrows shot up. "Uh-huh. Imogen handled herself like a true frontier woman," he continued, with a note of admiration in his voice. Before Mervyn could reply, the sound of a horse and rider approaching made them all turn. "Howdy, Sheriff." Jeff jumped down from Marty and threw his reins over the hitching post. "What brings you this way?" Sheriff Dean Reed circled his horse and jumped down, his spurs jingling as he led his horse to the water trough. Imogen could see patches of sweat on the horse's neck and under its cinch. It looked like the sheriff had been riding hard. "It's not a social visit, I'm afraid. I just got news about a pair of outlaws passing through the area. They robbed a stagecoach and killed the driver in a gunfight when one of the travelers tried to plead with them not to take their money." Where was this? Jeff's jaw tensed, and he frowned. The other side of Cottonwood Creek, about 40 miles or so, Reed replied. They might not bother heading this way, Mervyn said with a shrug. Slim pickings the further west they go, surely? Not necessarily. Reed glanced toward Imogen, and he gave her a polite nod. I don't want to worry you, ma'am, but we do get the occasional gangs of outlaws causing havoc. Imogen shivered. Murder and robbery sounded like more than havoc to her. There's no need for alarm, Sheriff Reed continued. I'm just letting folks know that's all. It's better to be aware so you can keep a lookout for anything unusual. Is it just the stagecoach they robbed? Jeff unsaddled Marty before turning his attention to Buttercup and helping Imogen down. Are they targeting cattle as well? There's me, Mervyn, and Frank, but our cattle are spread far and wide if we need to guard them. Reed hesitated for a moment, and Imogen sensed it was because of her presence. You don't need to hold back because of me, Sheriff. If I'm to be a ranch wife, it's best I understand everything, don't you think? Uh-huh, I suppose so. He swung himself back onto his horse and lowered his hat against the sun. We've kept the likes of them at bay in the past, Mervyn said with relish. Your pa and I saw off some rustlers on more than one occasion. Even your ma let off a few shots from the veranda, as I recall. I know, but we have Imogen, Eleanor, and the children to think of now. Jeff looked troubled. Like I said, I'm just letting you know as a precaution. I expect the marshals are on their tail already, and the outlaws will probably go to ground or head for the border. Well, count us in if you need a posse, Jeff said. I'm thinking of putting my name forward to be mayor, so I need to show I'm prepared to defend Willow Brook against men like them. Reed nodded thoughtfully. Mayor, huh? You'll be good for the place, Jeff. We need upstanding folks like you. Meanwhile, be sure and look after that purty fiancé of yours. With that, Sheriff Reed tipped his hat and wheeled his horse around to continue on to the next ranch. Let's hope they catch them soon, Imogen murmured, watching him leave. I'll keep you and your family safe, Jeff said firmly. She noticed that there was a new steely glint in his eye and nodded, knowing that he would. Chapter 5. Imogen chopped green beans and added them to the bacon and rice stew, which was simmering on top of the range. A pinch of salt and a twist of pepper came next, and then she dipped a spoon in and took a sip of the hearty broth, checking that the seasoning was to her liking. It was her second day cooking in the kitchen of the main homestead. True to his word, Jeff had asked his ma whether she would mind Imogen cooking for them all, and Jillian had been delighted at the suggestion. The day before, Imogen had cooked poached fish that Frank and Isaac had caught in the river, with mashed potatoes and corn, and her apple pie to follow with cream from the dairy cow had caused an appreciative silence to fall at the table as everyone tucked in. How are you getting on, Imogen? Jillian Hayden asked as she came into the kitchen. Are you finding your way around the place all right? Her cane tapped on the wooden floorboards. Although she didn't like using it, Dr. Clary had told her in no uncertain terms that if she fell over, it might leave her bedbound, so she had reluctantly agreed to do what he wanted. The range can be temperamental, especially if the wood is damp in the winter or if the wind is blowing from the north. No problems so far, Mrs. Hayden. Imogen put a lid on the stew and bobbed her head. She was a little nervous around her future mother-in-law, even though she had been nothing but welcoming. I think it's high time you called me Jillian. We're not used to being too fancy here, especially when it's only been me and the men for so long. She jiggled the door of the range oven and gave a satisfied nod. The wind's in the right direction for now, and that bread of yours smells mighty good. Thank you. I enjoy cooking. Imogen thought back to the generously sized kitchen she had cooked in when she was married to Horace, and they lived in New York. Although he was a moderately wealthy man and would have easily been able to afford to hire a maid and a cook, he never allowed Imogen to have any help around the home. It was just one of the ways that he liked to control her. But Imogen and Eleanor had grown up in a rougher neighborhood, where maids were an unaffordable luxury. So she had learned to cook when her ma worked as a seamstress. And after getting married, more time in the kitchen meant less time in Horace's company, which had suited her just fine. The unexpected benefit was also that now she thought nothing of making a meal for everyone on the ranch, and it was rewarding to see the men appreciate her food after a long day working outside. I thought I would make peach cobbler to have after the bacon stew. Do you think Jeff would like that? Gillian's blue eyes twinkled with amusement as she lowered herself into one of the chairs at the kitchen table. I don't think you'll get any complaints from him, or Mervyn and Frank for that matter. I couldn't do much about the house while I was ill, so they pretty much lived on Mervyn's beef, beans, and biscuits, from what I saw. He was used to cooking for himself when he was riding the trails, but I know they sure appreciate your food. You sure do have a lovely kitchen here. Imogen started weighing out flour and sugar for the cobbler. She was still mindful of the fact that this had been Gillian's domain for so many years, and it might be hard just to hand over the reins to her future daughter-in-law. You've made it very cozy. This is my favorite room. Gillian looked around as though seeing it through a stranger's eyes. There was a large dresser on one side, with all the crockery on it, and a long case clock ticked in the corner. It had been a wedding gift from her parents, and she wound it every Sunday evening. Henry liked me to keep a tidy house, she said, and he was always very particular about what time he wanted me to serve the meals. Woe betide if I was late, she murmured quietly under her breath. The view of the mountains through the window is wonderful, Imogen continued. I don't think I would ever get bored with seeing it, especially as the seasons change. I can tell that you and I are of a similar mind, Gillian said. I wasn't raised in a ranching family, and it was the beauty of the place that got me through those strange few months when we first arrived here with nothing other than what we had in our wagon. She gave Imogen a frank look. I love this ranch now, but it hasn't always been a happy place for Jeff and me. I'm guessing by the way you two have gotten closer these last few days that perhaps he's told you a little bit about what Henry was like when times were hard, or when the whiskey took hold of him. Imogen carried 2 cups to the table and poured coffee for them both. He did tell me a little bit, yes? She sat down next to Gillian and gave her a sympathetic smile. My first husband, Horace, treated me the same. You don't need to explain anymore, I understand. She looked into the steam rising from her coffee, lost in her thoughts for a moment. I figured perhaps you'd experienced something like it. It has a way of leaving its mark in a woman's demeanor that folks who understand can recognize. That's all in the past now, though, she said, meeting Gillian's eyes. The day Horace died, I vowed to myself that I would forgive and forget, and do my best to live a happier life as the Lord intended. I don't want you to worry about what Jeff might be like, Gillian said. She reached across the table and patted Imogen's arm. He's nothing like his pa. Jeff is a better man than Henry was in every way, and I'm delighted that he'll be marrying you. It's made me very happy having you and Eleanor here on the ranch, and seeing Isaac and Lily learning about the animals and helping me collect the eggs is like a breath of fresh air. They certainly love it here, Imogen chuckled. Isaac has already told me he wants to be just like Mervyn when he grows up, which means that Lily wants the same as well. They're like 2 peas in a pod. Gillian picked up her knitting, and the clacking of the needles was the only noise in the room for a moment. A place like this needs children, she murmured, seemingly intent on counting her stitches. It's a wonderful place for a child to grow up. One of the things that angered Henry was that he thought we might never have children to carry on the family name. I told myself it was in God's hands, but secretly I blamed myself. I was almost 40 when we were blessed with Jeff. I hoped that providing a son might make Henry happy, but he soon found plenty of other reasons to find fault with me. She pulled a fresh ball of yarn out of her knitting bag with a shrug. I guess what I'm saying is that the Lord might bless you and Jeff as well. Miracles happen when you least expect them. I'd better get the bread out of the oven. Imogen stood up hastily, not sure how she felt about the way the conversation had turned. Maybe the Lord will give us a miracle? Gillian's words had taken her by surprise, and Imogen secretly wanted nothing more than to start a family with Jeff. She had always assumed time was not on her side, but as Gillian had pointed out, it might not be too late. A waft of heat came from the oven as she opened it and pulled 2 freshly baked loaves out. They would need to cool for a little while, but there would be plenty to take some ham sandwiches out for the men who were working out in the fields, weeding the crops. "Jeff has some great plans for when he becomes mayor," Imogen said, changing the subject. She walked around to the dresser and started setting the table for lunch. Eleanor was doing some chores with the children in the other cabin, but they would be over soon. "I don't think that would be hard compared to Mayor Castleman," Jillian replied with a wry smile. He was always more interested in the power and status the position gave him rather than doing much for the town. "I admire how enthusiastic Jeff is about Willow Brook. He told me they might try to build another church where folks can meet and extend the school, so there can be 2 classrooms. It all comes down to money. That's the trouble. The towns on the railroad line get more settlers arriving and more businesses setting up, so folks earn more and then buy up plots of land. Do you think they might lay railroad track through Willow Brook sometime?" Imogen thought back to how Cottonwood Creek seemed like the sort of place Willow Brook could become. There has been talk of it. Jillian slowly got to her feet again. "I reckon I'll go and see if the washing is dry on the line yet. It will do me good to get outside. If Dr. Clary had his way, I'd be sitting by the hearth all day long. But I'm not ready for that. And I'll go across to see how Eleanor's getting on. She and the children are trying to start a vegetable garden by the little cabin." Just as Imogen reached the door to help Jillian down the veranda steps, a puff of dust rose up from the track in the distance. She squinted into the sun to see who it was, feeling a shiver of worry. "It's not the outlaws," Jillian said, patting her arm. "And if it was, I have the rifle loaded and ready behind the door." She grinned and gave Imogen a small wink. "Howdy, Mrs. Hayden." The young man approaching was riding a piebald horse with one blue eye. "It's a lovely day, and you're looking better than when I saw you last." He tipped his hat and brought the horse to a halt. "How are you doing, Leon? Still enjoying working for the post office?" "I sure am." He jumped down and opened the leather saddlebag. "Old Man Partridge has gotten me doing deliveries now. This letter came for you this morning, ma'am." He gave Imogen a cheerful smile and handed her an envelope, much to her surprise. "For me? Are you sure?" Leon faltered, and a tide of red came up his cheeks as he hastily snatched it back and read the writing on the front. "Letter for, Mrs. Brookwood." He shuffled his feet in the dust. "There was no address on it, and old Mr. Partridge didn't know who you were, but I recalled your name from when you said good morning to me outside Betty's Bakehouse when I was delivering a letter to Mr. Radcliffe." "That's very well remembered. Thank you." I'm a fast learner, ma'am." Leon looked proud of himself as he handed the letter back to her again. "And you can stop by any time you want to send a reply. We've even gotten one of them fancy telegraphs now. Ma'am, you can get a message to New York so fast it's as if they're just a few miles away now instead of the other side of the country." Imogen wandered a little distance away as Jillian started chatting with Leon, asking after his family. A faint sense of trepidation came over her as she looked at the envelope. She had left her old life behind and hadn't expected anyone to stay in contact with her, which is why nobody knew her new address here at High Bluff Ranch. Clearly, someone had wanted to track her down, but she couldn't think who it could be. She opened the envelope and was shocked to see that it was from Horace's lawyer in New York. "Dear Mrs. Brookwood, I hope this letter reaches you safely, as it has taken me some considerable effort to find out that you are now living in Willow Brook, Montana. With luck, it's a small enough community that the postmaster will be able to deliver this to you by your name alone. As you know, I acted as your late husband's lawyer. Although initially he left very little to you in his will, some new documents recently came to my attention from his estate. It transpires that he invested some of his money into property here in East New York. So as he had no children, you are now the rightful owner of these 3 properties. They comprise a building being used as a dressmaker's shop, with rooms above where the seamstress lives with her family. There are also 2 other houses that are being rented out. I have made discreet inquiries and can assure you that the families are well regarded in the district, and the husbands have good employment records. Therefore, I would consider them to be reliable tenants. When you write back to me to confirm that you have received this letter, I will forward the appropriate documents to you so the properties are legally transferred into your name, plus all the rent money which the rent collector has kept since your husband's death. On a personal note, I was rather disappointed that Mr. Brookwood left you in financial straits. Therefore, I am pleased to be the bearer of this good news that you are now more financially secure. One might even say wealthy. I will, of course, be happy to act on your behalf in these matters as your lawyer should you wish me to. Yours sincerely, Mr. Edward Crowthorpe. Imogen blinked rapidly and gazed around the ranch. She felt a strange sense of dislocation from the unexpected intrusion of news from New York and a part of her life that she had put behind her. Horace owned properties that I never even knew about. She shook her head, trying to take in this surprising fact. He had left her practically penniless in his will, yet he'd kept these secrets from her, almost as if he wanted to treat her cruelly, even after his death. "Thank goodness Mr. Crowthorpe is such an honest man," she muttered. But then she realized that, in some ways, her financial struggles had been a blessing in disguise. Being in financial hardship was the reason she had gone to stay with Eleanor in Pittsburgh. In turn, it meant she had been there to support Eleanor when Jacob had been killed in the railroad riots. And if I hadn't been left struggling to cope, perhaps I would never have answered Jeff's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Everything really did happen for a reason. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and she shook her head again. "Thank you, Lord," she murmured. "I know I didn't always understand the path you wanted me to follow, but I am truly grateful that you have brought me here to Jeff and the ranch." A breeze rustled through the nearby apple tree, and the chickens pecked underneath it, darting between tufts of grass for insects. She looked down at the letter again, and the seed of an idea started to form in her mind. "In your mercy, Lord, please guide me on how best to use this money I have unexpectedly come into." She thought about the plans Jeff had for Willow Brook once he became mayor, and nodded to herself. As if summoned by her thoughts, Jeff appeared from behind the barn, pushing a barrow of rocks in front of him. "I've been picking these off the field. Would they be any use to you in the garden?" he asked cheerfully. "If not, Mervyn will use them for shoring up the riverbank, I expect." "You must have read my thoughts." She walked over to him, pleased that he had returned in time for lunch instead of staying out on the land. "I was thinking it would be nice to edge the vegetable beds and have a path between them. Also, I could make a rose arbor by the apple trees with a seat underneath. It's a nice spot to catch the breeze and rest for a moment when I'm tending the garden. If you don't think a rose arbor would be too fanciful." Jeff set the barrow down and rubbed his hands on his pants to clean them. "That doesn't sound too fanciful at all. In fact, Ma talked about having a seat out in the garden for many years. We just never got around to doing it." His eyes narrowed as he suddenly noticed Leon on his horse trotting back down the track. "Did he deliver something for me? I was in the post office just a few days ago." Imogen held her letter aloft. "No, it was for me. I've had some good news from back east. It seems Horace invested in some properties in New York, which have now been passed to me. The lawyer had a hard time tracking me down, and he never knew about them until recently." Jeff couldn't hide the surprise on his face, and for a second, he looked worried. "Properties in New York, huh? That sounds complicated. Have you thought about how you might manage to sell them if you're not there?" Imogen slipped her hand through the crook of his arm and looked up into his brown eyes. "I've had a better idea," she said, smiling at him. "That figures," Jeff chuckled. "I'm learning that you're full of good ideas." "I trust Mr. Crowthorpe, the lawyer. I could ask him to keep an eye on the properties for me, and we can put the rent money which has accrued since Horace died to good use here in Willow Brook," Imogen said. Her words tumbled out as the idea solidified in her mind. She wanted to support Jeff's ambitions for the town, and now she would be able to do it in a more meaningful way. "We can use it to put towards the school and to make some improvements on the ranch. Whatever you think best, Jeff. I want you to know that I will always back you, And I want to be the sort of wife you will be proud of, she added breathlessly. You sure are full of surprises, Jeff said, laughing and shaking his head again. His eyes softened, and he lifted his hand to stroke her cheek. I don't know what I did to get this lucky. His voice was full of wonder, and he bent his head. She could tell he wanted to kiss her again, but he was too gentlemanly and pulled away again slightly, making her heart skip a beat. I could say the same thing, Imogen whispered. The emotions fizzed between them, heady with possibility. But let's get one thing straight. Jeff's expression was suddenly serious. I would always be proud to have you as my wife. This good fortune of yours changes nothing. I love you for who you are, not what you have. Imogen's heart swelled with happiness at Jeff's words. It was the first time he had told her he loved her, and she knew he hadn't found their courtship easy because of all the fears and worries it had brought up in him from his past. I want you to use the money as you choose, Imogen, Jeff continued. If you want to help Eleanor and the children, you must. Horace treated you badly, so if the money brings a little bit of happiness to you now, you deserve it. I always want to make sure that Eleanor and the children are well taken care of, but I want to support you as well, she said. Just don't rush into any decisions. Jeff's stomach growled with hunger, making Imogen laugh. That's enough talk about money. Seeing as you're here, will you come inside and have lunch with us? I can make some sandwiches to take out for Mervyn and Frank. Uh-huh. I came back hoping you might suggest that. I like it when we sit down to eat together. They walked up the veranda steps, and he took his hat off, running a hand through his hair. The sun was at its hottest, and he was looking forward to a glass of Imogen's lemonade. I haven't forgotten about seeing the pastor either, he added, shooting her a smile. I'm going to ride into town tomorrow and book the earliest date he has available. Never mind whether it clashes with me becoming the mayor. Our wedding is more important. In that case, I'd better tell Eleanor we need to sort out my wedding dress. Imogen waved toward her sister, who was heading across the dusty yard with Isaac and Lily. Do you fancy an outing to Cottonwood Creek? We need to get ready for the wedding. Her heart lifted as the children excitedly clapped their hands. Now that things were moving forward, Imogen had never felt happier. Chapter 6. You've gotten quite adept with this horse and wagon, Fiona remarked as they bowled along, and Cottonwood Creek came into sight. It was nice of you to invite me to your special day out. 2 weeks had passed since receiving the letter with Mr. Crowthorpe's news from New York. Imogen sat between Eleanor and Fiona on the seat of the buckboard wagon and rested the reins over Buttercup's broad rump. The mare had made the journey many times and whinnied as another wagon passed in the opposite direction, pulled by 2 mules. Howdy, ladies. Isn't it a lovely day? It was Jake Pascoe, the owner of the flour mill, who delivered regularly to Abraham at Betty's bakehouse. He grinned at Fiona, recognizing her from the bakehouse, and then tipped his hat. His smile lingered for a beat longer as he looked at Eleanor, and Imogen noticed a rosy flush color her sister's cheeks. It sure is, Imogen called back. She shot Eleanor a mischievous look once the wagons had passed. He seems rather taken with you. Maybe we'll be shopping for your wedding soon? Don't be so silly, Eleanor huffed. I'm perfectly happy raising Isaac and Lily and living out on the ranch with you. Life is busy enough without thinking about courting. Imogen felt momentarily deflated. She was determined not to let her sister remain unmarried for too long, but so far, her subtle attempts at matchmaking had been firmly rebuffed. But as she caught sight of the 2 hearts entwined matrimonial bureau, her good humor returned. Once she and Jeff were settled into married life, she would find a way to persuade Eleanor to meet with Esther McKinnon to see if a suitable husband for a kind-hearted widow with 2 young children could be found. As she and Jeff had proved, there was nothing wrong with having Esther's help to find the right man. I couldn't think of anyone nicer to have an outing with than you 2, Imogen said, answering Fiona's comment. And if shopping for the wedding isn't a good enough excuse to spend time with you, I don't know what is. Jeff didn't mind us having a day out? Eleanor asked. She knew Horace would never have permitted such a thing, and she was glad for Imogen's sake that Jeff seemed far more tolerant. He's spending the day with Mayor Castleman, going through some of the projects he never managed to get finished while he was in office. I'm sure he would have liked to join us, but I told him we were more than capable of going shopping on our own, and I want him to be surprised by whatever we buy for my wedding outfit. Are you feeling nervous? Fiona asked. When Abraham and I got married, it all happened so fast, I didn't have time to worry about a thing. Imogen considered the question. I'm not nervous about marrying Jeff, she said. Things were a bit strained to start with, and I thought he was having regrets. But now we get along so well. I know we're well suited. She slowed Buttercup to a walk as the street got busier. I guess the only thing I'm worried about is that marrying a second time feels somewhat different. I don't want to make a fool of myself by wearing something too fancy, which is why I value your opinion, both of you. It was a perfect summer's day without a cloud in the sky as they passed the Buckhorn Saloon. Although it was early, several cowboys were already lounging outside on a seat by the hitching rail, laughing loudly, and Imogen urged Buttercup to pass by a bit faster. 3 unaccompanied women were bound to draw a bit of attention, but she didn't want any drunken men to spoil their trip. The town's sheriff rounded the corner, and he gruffly told the men to keep the noise down, which reassured her. Remember when we first arrived here? Eleanor said. It's hard to believe it was only a few months ago. Everything though. Are we going to leave the wagon at the railroad station? That's what Jeff told me to do. Imogen pulled Buttercup to a halt, and Robert, the station master's son, came running out. Good morning, Mrs. Brookwood, he said, giving her a gap-toothed smile. I'm to take care of Buttercup and your wagon, ma'am. I always do it when Mr. Hayden comes to town. Buttercup knows me, and I've already gotten a nose bag of oats ready for her, so you don't have to worry about a thing while you do your shopping. Thank you, Robert. That's very reassuring. Imogen, Eleanor, and Fiona clambered down and shook the dust from their skirts. Mr. Hayden told me you would take good care of us. Here's a little something for your trouble. Imogen pressed a coin into the boy's palm, which he hastily pocketed before turning to stroke Buttercup. A few moments later, once she knew Buttercup was all right, Imogen looked up and down the street, wondering what they should do first. She already had a perfectly serviceable gown to wear for the wedding. It was a pale green sprigged muslin, which would not be too heavy for the hot weather, but it was too plain for her liking. The purpose of the visit to Cottonwood Creek was to purchase lace and ribbons, which could be added to the gown to make it more ornate. And if a small hat that might set the outfit off caught her eye while they strolled about town, that would be even better. Shall we go to the general store first? I remember they had a good selection of fancy goods and haberdashery, or perhaps you would prefer to have a cool drink first. Eleanor fluttered her fan in front of her face and loosened her shawl, hoping to catch the hint of a breeze that funneled between the buildings. Imogen noticed that Fiona looked rather pink as well. The day has definitely gotten hotter since they had set off from Willow Brook, and the thought of having some refreshments before they started their shopping was appealing. Let's go to Mrs. Mayhew's tea shop first, Imogen said decisively. We won't be able to think straight if we are all parched with thirst. Jeff said we should make a day of it, and it will give us a chance to cool down out of the sun and make a plan. Eleanor chuckled. Listen to us. It's not as if Cottonwood Creek is the size of New York or Pittsburgh for shopping. I know how times have changed. Imogen looked up and down the street again. You know what, though? I prefer this. Even if we can visit every store in town in less than a day, between Cottonwood Creek and Willow Brook, we have everything we need. With that, she sailed off ahead of the others, making a beeline for the charming tea room just past the Mercantile. 3 cups of iced tea and 3 slices of ginger cake for you. Mrs. Mayhew's niece carefully placed the items on the table in front of them, the tip of her tongue poking out of her mouth with concentration. Don't forget to ask them if there's anything else they would like, Mrs. Mayhew prompted in a loud whisper as she hovered nearby. She glanced toward Imogen to explain more. My niece, Flora, only arrived on the train last week after my sister succumbed to influenza. God rest her soul. This is the first job she's had, but she's showing promise. Imogen shot the nervous girl a reassuring smile. "She has served us very nicely, Mrs. Mayhew. I'm sure she will be a credit to the tea shop as she settles in." "Do you have everything you want, ma'am?" Flora turned pink as she looked at them expectantly. "Yes, and this looks delicious. Thank you." The bell on the door tinkled just as they were starting to eat, and a plump woman bustled in. "Fiona?" "And Imogen and Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise to see you all here." "Norma, how lovely to see you." Fiona stood up to welcome her old friend, Norma White, who had been a guest at the Blue Pines boarding house at the same time as her when she had first arrived in Willow Brook. It was thanks to Norma's quick thinking that Sheriff Reed had been on hand to arrest Walter Jessup, who had been intent on robbing Abraham at Betty's bakehouse one evening not so long ago. "What are you doing here, Norma?" Imogen asked. "I haven't seen you since Fiona and Abraham's wedding when you were talking about leaving Willow Brook to go somewhere livelier." "Well, there's a tale," Norma exclaimed. "May I join you?" Mrs. Mayhew hastily fetched a stick chair and brought it to the table so that Norma could sit with the other three women. "Have you decided to stay in Willow Brook after all?" Eleanor asked. "I do hope so." Fiona had a soft spot for the outspoken woman, even though she had found her rather too opinionated when they had first met. "I sure have," Norma said jovially. The rings on her fingers sparkled as she waved her hands in an all-embracing gesture toward the mountains in the distance through the window. "I've gotten kind of accustomed to being here in Montana now. As you know, I thought it would be a little dull for my tastes, but there's plenty going on once you get to know folks." She gave the three ladies a coy smile before thanking Flora for her cup of tea. "I've met some interesting gentlemen as well, including your Mervyn," she added, tapping the side of her nose and laughing. "I figured I would stick around and see if anything comes from it." "You mean you're courting?" Before Norma could reply, the doorbell tinkled again, and a tall gentleman walked in, catching Imogen's attention. He tipped his hat politely before settling himself at a table in the corner and ordering a cup of coffee. Imogen wondered idly whether he was local. She didn't recognize him, and she made a mental note to ask Mrs. Mayhew before they left if she knew him. "You see, Eleanor," Imogen said, turning back to the table, "Norma is proof that there are plenty of eligible men who are eager to get married. Just because we were all widowed doesn't mean we don't deserve a second chance at love." "Romance is all that Imogen can think about at the moment," Eleanor said to Norma, rolling her eyes good-naturedly. "My sister does like to exaggerate," Imogen shot back. She glanced across at the man again, finding him intriguing. His hair was a shade too long, and the leather of his boots was cracked as though he had fallen on hard times, but his pants and suede vest were well cut. He seemed like the sort of man who would prefer the company of men in the saloon, not sipping coffee in Mrs. Mayhew's tea shop. Perhaps he was waiting to meet his sweetheart, she wondered. The more she looked, she realized that she had seen him standing nearby when they had been hitching Buttercup, and she had noticed him glancing toward their table several times. Maybe he's taken with Eleanor? The thought pleased her. "We need to focus on your wedding first, starting with finding some nice ribbons and lace today." Eleanor's comment pulled Imogen's attention back to their table. "What about a new shawl, too? You need to have some smart clothes, what with Jeff's new position." "Not only is Imogen getting married soon, but Jeff is going to become the town mayor any day now," Fiona explained to Norma. "I had heard a rumor about Mayor Castleman retiring. Jeff will be perfect to take his place," Norma said with a warm smile. "He's always very polite when I meet him in town. He'll be lucky to have you by his side, Imogen." "It takes a special sort of wife to support her husband when he's in public office, and I'm sure he will have some grand ideas for little old Willow Brook." "He sure does. And as it happens, I received some exciting news as well recently," Imogen said, lowering her voice slightly. "That sounds intriguing." Norma leaned slightly closer, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "It seems my sister has just become a wealthy woman," Eleanor murmured. "It's been quite the surprise. My late husband, Horace, invested in some properties in New York, which I never knew about. The rent from the tenants is quite a significant amount each month, and dear Jeff is insisting that everything remains in my name. Imogen took a sip of her iced tea, enjoying the way Norma was hanging on to every word. "So you're a wealthy widow, huh? I can tell you a thing or two about that," Norma said with a burst of laughter. She had never made any secret of the fact that her late husband had left her well taken care of financially. "I've promised Jeff that I want to put the money to good use. I can help expand High Bluff Ranch and support any improvements he wants to make to the town. This is my home now, so it will be well spent if it helps our community." "That's very generous of you." Norma glanced down at her bejeweled fingers and adjusted one of her rings. "I've had to fend off my share of men who were only interested in me because of my money. Your Jeff, on the other hand, seems like an honest, hard-working sort of man, not someone to take advantage of your good fortune. Certainly not. Jeff would never behave in such a way." Imogen felt a warm glow in her heart as she thought again about the secret kiss they had shared at the Gulch. "It's nice that something good can finally come out of your marriage to Horace," Eleanor said firmly. "He was always so miserly toward you, and to think he had money invested in properties all that time." "I know. I can still scarcely believe it. It will be a nest egg. You can use the rent money for charitable deeds now, and you can sell the properties if you ever need to." Norma dabbed the corner of her mouth daintily with her napkin. "I used to help my first husband with his accounts, and 3 properties in New York would be worth a considerable amount." Imogen shrugged. "I'm just grateful that I can help Jeff. Now, let's talk about our shopping trip. Do you think I need a new hat?" The next half hour passed pleasantly as they discussed her wedding outfit, and Norma regaled them with colorful stories from her past. There was more to the plump, loudly spoken woman than Imogen had realized, and she was glad to count her as a friend. "I'll let you know the date for my wedding as soon as Jeff has spoken with the pastor," Imogen said as they all stood up a little while later, feeling refreshed. "We'll be having a small gathering of friends after the church service, and it would be lovely if you would join us, Norma." "Nothing could keep me away," Norma said enthusiastically. "Now, you'd better get on with your shopping. I'm heading to the dressmaker's to be fitted for a new gown and staying in one of the town's boarding houses for a few nights. But I'll be back in Willow Brook by the end of the week." As the women exchanged farewells and stepped out onto the street, Imogen noticed the man hastily paying for his coffee and putting his hat on again. He hurried out of the tea room after them and met her eyes with a look that was hard to read. "Imogen?" He whipped his hat off again and edged a little closer. "Did I get it right? Are you Imogen Brookwood?" he asked. She stopped and looked at him, feeling startled that he knew her name. For a moment, it seemed as though there was something strangely familiar about the man, as though she knew him from somewhere before. But it was impossible. She had a good memory for faces, and other than seeing him near the railroad station earlier that day, she couldn't remember him from anywhere else. "Come along, Imogen," Eleanor said impatiently. "It's too hot to stand outside in the sun." Imogen gave her a quick nod and then turned back to the man. Her curiosity was piqued. "I'm Mrs. Brookwood," she told him. "Do I know you from somewhere?" A look of relief mixed with apprehension tracked across his face as he stepped closer still. "I'm sorry if it seemed like I was listening to your conversation in there," he said, jerking his head toward the tea room. "It's just, when I heard the other women mention your name, I thought it had to be too good to be true." What was too good to be true? Eleanor came to stand at Imogen's side protectively. "Is this gentleman bothering you?" she asked. "I was just explaining who I am." The man lowered his gaze for a moment and then met Imogen's eyes again. "I'm Mr. Ackhurst, Carl Ackhurst. I believe you replied to my advertisement in the Matrimonial Times last year, and we exchanged letters for a while. If you are the Imogen Brookwood I think you are?" Imogen felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, and her mouth gaped open in shock. "Carl?" Memories came flooding back into her mind. Deciding to reply to an advertisement for a gentleman seeking a wife, even though Eleanor had tried to dissuade her from doing it. Then the sense of excitement when Mr. Ackhurst wrote back saying he would be delighted to correspond with her. She had thought they had a good sense of connection in their letters, which had gone back and forth between them for several months. But then the letters had stopped with no warning. She had written 4 more times, trying to find out what was going on, but then her self-pride told her it was over and time to move on. She had felt disappointed at the time, but then, undeterred, a few weeks later, she had replied to Jeff's advertisement instead, and now she and Jeff were about to be married. "This is the Mr. Ackhurst who you wrote to, Imogen?" Eleanor gasped, looking between the two of them. "Uh-huh, the very same." Carl barely glanced at Eleanor, fixing his gaze on Imogen instead. But you stopped writing to me." Imogen shook her head, trying to make sense of this strange coincidence. She knew he had been living at Cottonwood Creek, but it never occurred to her that he might still be there. "I thought perhaps you had died or met someone else. I wrote 4 times, but received no reply from you." Carl had the good grace to look apologetic. "I was struck down by a fever." He ran a finger around his shirt collar as though it was too tight. "I was ill for months. It nearly killed me, and I even lost my memory for a while. By the time I was well enough to start writing to you again, I figured it was too late." "Well, you figured right," Eleanor said firmly with a disapproving sniff. She linked arms with Imogen. "We're shopping for my sister's wedding dress today, and she's marrying the future mayor of Willow Brook." "Yes, I overheard some of your conversation," Carl said quietly, still addressing Imogen directly. His mouth twisted into a rueful smile. "Your husband-to-be is a very lucky man. I'm realizing now what a fool I was to stop writing to you, even though my letters would have been garbled nonsense, what with the fever and all." "Do you still live in Cottonwood Creek?" Imogen tried to recall the details of his advertisement and his first few letters. She remembered something about a small plot of land and his hopes to expand. "I'm moving on," Carl said. His gaze slid away from her. Imogen waited for him to enlarge on his comment, but he seemed suddenly more interested in watching the wagons rolling past. "Well, it was nice to make your acquaintance, Mr. Ackhurst," she said slowly. "As my sister mentioned, I'm marrying Mr. Hayden, the new mayor of Willow Brook." "Oh, marriage to a wealthy rancher who happens to be the mayor, too. I can see how that would be a grand future to look forward to." He put his hat back on and pulled the brim lower as some folks passing on the other side of the street turned to look at them. Imogen stared at Mr. Ackhurst, who looked as though he was about to leave, wondering why there was a sudden note of bitterness in his voice. How does he know Jeff is a wealthy rancher? The question slipped into her mind, making her shiver with a sense of anxiety. Did Carl know Jeff? Was there bad blood between them? "Wait, do you know?" "Good day to you," Ackhurst said abruptly, cutting across her. Before she had a chance to ask him any more, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her none the wiser. "What a very strange encounter," Eleanor said, glaring at his retreating back. "Why bother speaking to you after all this time?" Why indeed? Imogen couldn't help but feel unsettled by his sudden change of demeanor. Surely he couldn't be jealous of her marrying Jeff? It was so long since her brief correspondence with him that she had all but forgotten about it and thought he would have done as well. "He's probably just surprised to see you here," Fiona said with a shrug. "If you think about it, of all the places you could have traveled to marry, it's a remarkable coincidence that you replied to Jeff, who lives just a short wagon ride away. Anyway, let's forget about it. We've got ribbons and lace to buy and a wedding to plan." Eleanor beamed at them both, and Imogen nodded, putting it to the back of her mind. Chapter 7. "Don't forget to take this food for your lunch," Imogen called. She clattered down the veranda steps and picked her way across the muddy barnyard. "I packed you up some ham and pickle rolls and fruit cake," she explained, handing the parcel up to Jeff, who was already sitting astride Marty, ready to leave. The gelding swished his tail, eager to go. "You spoil us," Mervyn said, tipping his hat toward her. "Thank you, ma'am." Frank's eyes lit up. "It sure is a heap better than another of Mervyn's bean stews." He leaned down to check that his saddle's cinch was tight enough as his horse fidgeted beneath him. "That's kind of you, Imogen," Jeff said, giving her a distracted smile. "I'm not sure whether we'll be back in time for dinner. It depends on whether more of the Gulch Bank has slipped since I checked it. Don't wait for us." "Do you know how bad the damage is?" She glanced toward the distant hills, where more ominous gray clouds were rolling in. The unexpected summer storm, a couple of days earlier, had caught her by surprise in its ferocity. There had been thunder, lightning, and torrential rain. It had certainly given Imogen a taste of just how untamed the Montana weather could be after the last few calm, sunny weeks. It was hard to believe she had taken the wagon to Cottonwood Creek with Fiona and Eleanor only a few days earlier. The change in the weather had come so fast. "It's not the first time we've had a mudslide in the gulch," Jeff said. He tugged the brim of his hat lower and gave Marty a reassuring pat on his neck. The three horses could sense the men's urgency, and their ears were pricked forward because they wanted to get going. "We're going to need to cart rocks to shore up the bank, and then mend fences. I don't want to run the risk of the cattle all running over the edge of the gulch if we get another storm and they panic. The cattle at the back could end up pushing the front ones into the river, and they'd be swept away just like that." Frank snapped his fingers, making Imogen jump. "I remember it happened at old Stumpy Joe's ranch when I worked there. We lost 10 good beasts, and it isn't something I ever want to see again. Never mind thinking the worst and scaring Mrs. Brookwood, young Frank. We'll make good progress today, boss," Mervyn said easily. "It's nothing we haven't handled before. Good luck." Imogen clasped her hands together, still feeling worried. "I'll be praying that the damage in the gulch isn't too bad." Part of her wished she could go with them, but she had plenty to get on with in the garden. As Mervyn and Frank turned their horses and started to leave the barnyard, Jeff suddenly leaned forward in his saddle and cupped his hand around her cheek to caress it. "We'll be married by this time next week," he said softly. "I can't wait to be your husband." Imogen's heart skipped a beat as the blood rushed to her face, and she looked up into his brown eyes. A sudden desire to be held in his strong arms made her shiver. "Just promise me you'll take care. I would hate for any of you to have an accident." She could picture the loose rocky scree on the steep bank and imagined how the tumbling river had probably turned into a foaming torrent. "Don't worry, I don't want to do anything to jeopardize our wedding and the rest of our lives together." She tried not to let her fears engulf her as she watched Jeff ride away to catch up with Mervyn and Frank. The slick mud in the track squelched under the horses' hooves, and she reminded herself that the men were well used to the extreme terrain of the ranch, no matter what time of year it was. There would be snowdrifts in the winter and more floods. She didn't doubt, but Jeff knew what he was doing. In fact, he had already told her that with a few days of sunshine, she would hardly know the storm had occurred. "Good luck and take care, my love," she whispered again. She put her hand up to her cheek, smiling to herself as she traced where Jeff had stroked his thumb just a moment before. Now that the wedding was so close, she often found her thoughts drifting off to how things would change after their marriage, when they would be together properly as man and wife. Her belongings would be moved into the main cabin, and they would share a bed. Would they have a baby together? It was in the hands of the Lord, but she hoped so. The sound of Jillian's cane tapping made Imogen turn round. The old lady had come out onto the veranda, and Imogen noticed that she looked paler than usual. "Did the men get off okay?" Jillian asked. "Uh-huh, you've just missed them. Would you like me to make you a cup of coffee or pour you some lemonade? It's still very humid outside, and the mud is slippery. It's probably best if you stay in the cabin." "I think you're probably right," Jillian said. She sighed wearily. "Storms like this never used to bother me, but I haven't been sleeping so well lately. I think I might lie down for an hour, and I'm sure I'll feel better later. I don't want Dr. Clary telling me off for not resting." "Let me take care of the chores today," Imogen said hastily. "I just need to milk the cow and feed the piglets, and then I'll come inside and start making lunch. There's nothing that won't wait, so you go ahead and have a nap." A distant rumble of thunder made them both look toward the mountains. "Do you think we'll get another storm?" Imogen shivered in spite of the heat. Jillian slowly scanned the horizon before shaking her head. "I reckon it might go round us, God willing. I'm sure there is quite enough damage for the men to fix without it being made any worse." She turned and hobbled back inside. "Don't worry about making me a cup of coffee," she added with a smile over her shoulder. "It's too hot anyway. The children can help me pod peas later on if they like." Imogen hurried over to the barn and fetched her pail and three-legged stool before settling herself against the cow's flank. The rhythmic movement of milking the dairy cow took her mind off the storm, and she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction as 2 jets of warm milk foamed into the bucket. The first time she had tried to milk the cow, she had scarcely managed to get a drop out before the cow kicked the bucket over. But now it was second nature. And the animal munched contentedly on her hay, barely even noticing that Imogen was there. "Thank you, ma'am," Imogen said when she stood up again a little while later. Jeff teased her for speaking to the animals, but she did it nonetheless. She set the bucket aside and draped a muslin cloth over the top to keep it clean while she did the rest of her barn chores. She had a bowl of vegetable scraps from the kitchen to give to the piglets, and the chickens needed more corn. Then she just had to collect the eggs and take the milk back to the kitchen, where she would churn some into butter later in the day. "Do you have a minute?" Eleanor's question floated over to her as she picked her way through the mud from her log cabin. "Of course. Maybe the children would like to help me collect the eggs. I just need to feed the piglets first, but that won't take long." Eleanor grinned. "You sound like a rancher's wife already." "I like it," Imogen shrugged. She took the comment as a compliment. "I'm not sure about which of these ribbons to decorate your wedding dress with." Eleanor almost slipped over as she approached and grabbed the edge of the barn door to steady herself, although Imogen noticed that the mud had started to dry out just in the time she had been in the barn. It wouldn't be slippery for much longer. "What do you think?" Eleanor held up the 2 ribbons. One was the color of new green leaves in spring, and the other was a peacock blue. Fiona had insisted on buying them both in Cottonwood Creek as a gift, telling Imogen that even if she had one spare, she could use it to trim one of her other gowns. "Which color do you think will go best with your wedding dress?" Imogen tipped her head slightly to one side and looked at them. "I think this one would be nicest, don't you?" Before Eleanor had time to reply, the chickens suddenly cackled in alarm and scattered across the barnyard, and the rooster flapped up on top of the chicken coop and started crowing, the same way he did when the coyotes came too close. "What's gotten into them? They must still be spooked by the storm. Perhaps I'd better shut them." Imogen's words died on her lips, and she gasped with surprise as a stranger suddenly emerged from behind the barn, with his hand resting casually on the holstered gun at his hip. She saw Eleanor's eyes widen with fear. "Howdy, ladies," the man drawled cheerfully. His battered hat was pulled low over his brow, and the bottom half of his face was concealed where he had pulled his neckerchief up. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt if you do what we say." There was an edge to his voice this time. His hand hovered over his gun again, and Imogen's mouth went dry as she looked at him. Who are you? What do you want?" Her questions came out louder than she had intended, and the man frowned. "Don't go thinking you can holler for someone to rescue you," he growled. He glanced over his shoulder. "Are you going to help me or what?" he demanded. A second man who was half a head taller emerged from the shadows, holding the reins of 2 horses. "Uh-huh, of course," he muttered. All Imogen could see was the man's eyes, which flickered between her and Eleanor. She sensed he was calmer than the other man, who was glancing nervously around. "My husband and the other ranch hands will be back any minute," Imogen said forcefully. "You should leave now, while you still can, and don't come back again." The first man chuckled humorlessly and shook his head. "We know they're on the far side of the ranch, and it's just you here, along with the old woman. She won't be bothering us." "Have you hurt Jillian?" Imogen snapped. A cold finger of fear slithered down her back. "What do you take us for?" The man in front of her gave an exaggerated sigh. "We only hurt people who don't do as they're told." "She was fast asleep. We just made sure she wouldn't start yelling for help, is all." Eleanor edged closer to Imogen. "Well, what do you want?" she asked. The man lifted his hat and scratched his head before jamming it back over his lank hair again. It looked like he hadn't had a good wash for weeks, and Imogen resisted the urge to wrinkle her nose. "Saddle a horse each and make it quick," he ordered, jerking his thumb toward Buttercup and the other horses in the corral. "You're coming with us." "Huh? Hold up a minute, Jason." The second man stepped forward, shaking his head. He sounded annoyed. We don't need both of them. Having two will slow us down. Out of the corner of her eye, Imogen saw Isaac and Lily peeking out of the bedroom window in the small log cabin. Don't take my sister, Eleanor, she pleaded. She has young children, and they need her. I don't know what you want, but please leave her alone. Please just let her go. The two men eyed each other, and an unspoken message passed between them. It's what we agreed, Jason, the tall man said. His gaze lingered on Imogen, making her skin crawl. All right. Jason huffed nervously again and then glared at Imogen. You saddle up your horse, and don't even think of messing us about. The last man who thought he could outwit us regretted it. He pulled his gun out of its holster and waved it at Eleanor. Turn around. You need to be tied up so we can make a clean getaway. Imogen's hands were trembling as she quickly opened the corral. Thankfully, Buttercup had already ambled over to the gate and was eager for an outing, allowing herself to be caught and led to the barn. Her heart hammered as she threw the saddle over Buttercup's broad back and tightened the cinch. If she hoped to glean any more about why she was being targeted, she was quickly disappointed. The taller of the men seemed to be the leader, and every time Jason started muttering about taking Eleanor as well, so they could get more money, he scowled at him. My horse is ready, Imogen said. She took a deep breath, wondering if she would ever see Eleanor and the people she loved again. Please, won't you tell me what's going on? Are you going to kill me? She stumbled over the words as Jason checked the thin rope he had used to tie Eleanor to the hay rack in the barn. The tall man shook his head, lowering his hat again so as to avoid looking at her directly. You're coming with us. That's all you need to know for now. And if you behave and you're worth what we think you are, we'll cut you loose when we've gotten the money, the smaller man said with a wheezing laugh. Quiet, Jason. You talk too much. Where's the harm in them knowing? Jason's voice was whiny, as though he resented being second best. He stomped over to stand in front of Eleanor and waved his gun in her face. If you want your sister to live, stay here and give us a good head start. If the sheriff sends a posse, you won't find us, not until we've got her money. He turned to stare hard into Imogen's eyes as well. Tell her, he snarled. Eleanor, just do what they want. I'll be fine. Imogen elbowed Jason out of the way, determined to give her sister a hug. Tell Isaac and Lily I'll be back in no time, she added, blinking back her tears as Eleanor nodded mutely. We'd better get going now. The taller of the two men circled Buttercup around to the mounting block so Imogen could get into the saddle. Before she climbed up, he lashed her hands together. Don't want to risk you thinking you can outrun us on this old mare, he muttered. For a moment, he almost sounded apologetic, but then his eyes hardened again as he vaulted onto his horse and looked around at the barnyard with its two cabins and sleek cattle grazing in the distance. Some men don't deserve so much good fortune, he growled. He jerked his head at Imogen. Ride in front of me, where I can keep an eye on you. So long, Jason said. He shoved Eleanor so she fell to her knees and crumpled to the ground, banging her head against the stable door. He ignored her groan of pain and strode away to jump onto his horse. And remember, he called back to her, if you want to see your sister again, no talking. He pressed a finger to his mouth with one last cackle of amusement and spurred his horse into a gallop, lifting his hat. We're going to be rich real soon, he whooped. Imogen risked one last backward look over her shoulder, taking in everything she had grown to love. The cozy homestead, her family, and the animals Jeff worked so hard to raise. Will I ever see Jeff and my family again? Are my dreams going to be snatched from me by these two outlaws? It seemed too awful to contemplate, so she pressed her lips together and decided she would go along with their demands, just until she had an opportunity to escape. It took all of Imogen's self-control not to scream and shout for help. Trying to ride Buttercup with her wrists bound was difficult, which helped distract her, and it was only as they followed the narrow tracks through unclaimed land beneath the mountains that the gravity of her situation started to hit her. One of the men was in front of her and one behind to make sure she stayed where they wanted her. She would never be able to find her way back, and from the occasional comment the men made, It sounded as though they had been watching the comings and goings at High Bluff Ranch for a few days. The sun arced higher in the sky, and sweat trickled down her back until, mercifully, they reached an area of woodland where the trees provided some shade. Hours had passed already, and the lengthening shadows told her that it would soon be nightfall. "Isn't it time to make camp yet?" Jason asked from in front of her. He twisted in his saddle to look past her at the other man, who had been silent for practically the whole journey. "And can we ditch these ridiculous masks?" He grumbled. "If she's going to be with us for the next week or longer, there's no point trying to stay disguised." "We'll stop at the next clearing," the man behind her said gruffly. There was something familiar in his voice that snagged at the edge of her mind. She wondered for one crazy moment whether it was someone from Willow Brook, but then dismissed the idea. Surely nobody local would be brazen enough to kidnap her from under Jeff's nose. "About time. I'm hungry, and there's a bottle of whiskey in my saddlebag that's calling to me." Jason whistled tunelessly under his breath as they loped along. "We'll have some food and rest overnight. Tomorrow will be a long day if we're going to put a good distance between ourselves and the lawmen." The taller of the two men urged his horse forward and came to ride alongside Imogen. "I hope your husband is sensible enough not to send a posse after us. Everything will be much simpler if you let us get on and do what we need to do." "And what exactly is that?" Imogen demanded. She was suddenly fed up with biting her tongue and going along with their plan. "What do you want with me? I'm just an ordinary widow, looking forward to my wedding. At least I was." "You're not so ordinary," the man replied with a humorless chuckle. "In the words of your sister, you're a wealthy woman." His words hung between them, and his dark eyes bored into her as he waited for her to understand. "What do you mean? Eleanor never mentioned anything about me being wealthy." Imogen's mind raced as she tried to figure out who the man was. He seemed to know things about her and was taking pleasure in toying with her emotions. "Not today. She didn't. You're right," he chuckled again. "But you couldn't stop talking about your money in the tea shop the other day." Imogen's stomach lurched with a sickening realization. You were in Cottonwood Creek, listening to us?" "Let's just say you weren't exactly very discreet." The man tugged his neckerchief down and grinned at her. "Carl Ackhurst?" Imogen grabbed onto her saddle horn as Buttercup fidgeted under her at hearing the shock in her voice. Carl eyed her dispassionately. "Spotting you outside the railroad station with your friends was a surprise. But once I figured you were soon to be marrying Jeff Hayden, my curiosity was piqued. I figured it wouldn't harm to find out a bit more about you, and then, when I overheard that you're a woman of private wealth, it was even more interesting." Imogen shuddered at the thought that he had pretended to be so charming and friendly to her outside the tea shop. What did he want from her? She still didn't understand, but then she remembered how he had seemed jealous of Jeff. "What you're doing doesn't make any sense." She gave him a direct look, hoping to appeal to his better nature. "I'm not as wealthy as you think. It's just some rent money from my late husband's tenants. Besides, it's all in New York. I don't have anything here." Carl shrugged as though it was of no consequence. "Jason and I are wanted for a stagecoach robbery and murder. If a posse of lawmen finds us, they won't dare shoot with the fiancé of Mayor Hayden with us." "So the money was just a ruse?" "Oh no," Carl said with another grin that made him look slightly deranged. "The money is an unexpected bonus. When we've gotten far enough away not to be recognized, you're going to send a telegraph to New York and ask for the money to be sent to you. By the sound of things, it should be more than enough for me and Jason to get to another state where folks don't know us." "Jeff won't sit back and do nothing," Imogen cried. "He loves me, and he'll come looking for me." This time, Carl's laughter was louder still. "Why do you think I chose you? The fact that Jeff Hayden is going to be beside himself with worry just makes this little adventure even more pleasurable to me." "What's he ever done to you? Are you a business acquaintance?" "Jeff's a good man." Imogen shivered again. It seemed like Carl harbored some sort of vendetta, although his logic was hard to follow. "He crossed me, and he needs to pay." Carl shrugged again and gave her a stony look. "He isn't the kind-hearted man folks think he is. he added mysteriously. Chapter 8. Jeff hammered his final nail into the fence post and then straightened up so that he could stand back and check his work. His shoulder muscles had the satisfying ache he enjoyed from a job well done, and he tilted his hat to the back of his head to wipe the sweat from his brow. "I think that should be enough rocks to stop any more of the gulch's bank slipping away," Mervyn called. He wiped his muddy hands on his pants before reaching down to pull Frank back up from the scree slope, which was more secure thanks to their efforts. "It wasn't as bad as we thought, boss," Frank said cheerfully as he turned to look back at their handiwork. "It should hold, even if there's another storm. And now that you've mended the fence, the cattle won't be able to break through. It's not as bad as the damage I saw that time at Stumpy Joe's ranch, that's for sure." "I reckon we've done enough out here for now," Jeff replied. His stomach rumbled as he thought about the food Imogen had given them to have for lunch, and he started walking back towards the horses. The drum of distant hoofbeats drifted toward him, and he screwed his eyes up against the sun to see who it was. He half expected it to be Imogen on Buttercup, and he looked forward to showing her what he and the men had achieved. "Huh? What's Eleanor doing coming up from the homestead?" he muttered under his breath when he realized it wasn't Imogen after all. She was barely managing to stay in the saddle of his ma's old horse, and he was gripped with a sudden sense of foreboding. Something must be wrong. "Jeff, Imogen has been taken," she cried. The old horse slowed before coming to an abrupt halt next to him, practically unseating Eleanor, and she grabbed the saddle horn as she lurched forward. "You have to come now, before it's too late." Her words came out in short bursts, and her voice was high-pitched with panic. "Easy, Snowy." Jeff steadied the prancing horse and helped Eleanor down. "Take a deep breath and tell me from the beginning. You're not making any sense." "What's happening, boss?" Mervyn and Frank hurried over, both looking alarmed. "It's Imogen. She's been kidnapped, but it was hours ago," Eleanor cried. "What? Tell me it's not so?" Jeff suddenly noticed the red welts on her wrists as she stood, trembling in front of him. "Did they tie you up?" "Yes." Her teeth started to chatter. "2 men showed up at the ranch and took Imogen. They tied me up in the barn and your ma in the house. Isaac and Lily were too scared to come out of the cabin for a while, which is why it took me so long to get free and come and find you." Mervyn gently put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders to comfort her. "Just tell us everything you know in your own time." "That's everything," Eleanor croaked. Tears pooled in her eyes, and she blinked them away. "They just came out of nowhere, 2 of them. They wanted to take us both, but then the taller man, he seemed to be the leader, said that they only needed Imogen. It sounded like they know you, Jeff." Jeff had already mounted Marty and gathered up his reins. "We need to fetch the sheriff and go after them. She could be anywhere by now." Without saying a word, Mervyn swung Eleanor up onto his saddle and then vaulted up, so he was sitting behind her. He reached around her to pick up his reins and spurred his horse on. "I don't mean to be overfamiliar, Mrs. Brent, but there's no time to lose. Frank will lead Snowy back, and you just hold tight with me. You've had a terrible shock, but we'll do whatever's needed to get Imogen back." Jeff rode Marty hard, kicking him into a gallop that churned the mud behind him. When he skidded into the yard, he was surprised to see Sheriff Reed was already there. He had just hitched his horse outside the log cabin and was strolling up the veranda steps. "I thought I'd come in and say howdy to you all after I was in such a rush last time," he said, taking his hat off. No sooner had the words left his mouth than the door flew open, and Jillian came hobbling out. Her face was gray with worry, and she rushed past him to the front of the veranda. "Did you hear what's happened, Jeff?" she called. "Are you all right, Ma?" Jeff sprinted across the barnyard, looking her up and down. "Eleanor told me they tied you up as well as her." "What's this?" Sheriff Reed asked in consternation. "Who's been tied up?" "Don't worry about me, son," Jillian said. "It's Imogen you need to find." "It's lucky you turned up out of the blue," Jeff said tersely, shooting the sheriff a hard look. He took his hat off and raked his hand through his hair, feeling too agitated to stand still. "We need to get a posse together." "Hold up, Jeff. How about you explain exactly what's been happening before we go tearing off?" "Eleanor can tell it best," Mervyn said. He helped her down from his horse and threw the reins to Frank. Get the horses rubbed down and watered. We need them ready to ride out again as soon as possible." "No, it's too much for her nerves," Jeff said gruffly. "She's only just managed to free herself to come and find us." His eyes narrowed as he scanned his land, looking for the slightest hint of movement or something out of place, while he quickly explained to the sheriff what Eleanor had told them up at the gulch. "No wonder you're worried," Reed said, sucking in his cheeks with a frown as Jeff finished. Mervyn escorted Eleanor onto the veranda, holding her elbow, and offered her a seat, but she shook her head. "You have to do something, Sheriff. Every minute we're spending here gives them more time to take my sister further away." Reed held up his hands. "I need to know more about it first. Otherwise, we could go off on a wild goose chase in the wrong direction. Can you describe the men, ma'am?" he asked her urgently. "Anything at all that you can remember about them." Eleanor screwed her eyes tightly closed and started speaking slowly. The first man was short and wiry, kind of scruffy looking, as though he hadn't washed for a while. The other man, who came out from behind the barn, second. He seems to be the one in charge. He's about this tall. She opened her eyes and held her hand up to about the same height as Jeff. His eyes are brown, and he didn't sound as rough speaking as the first one. "What about names?" Sheriff Reed nodded encouragingly. "It's probably too much to hope for, but did they let slip their names?" "Of course, how stupid of me." Eleanor blushed and nodded. "I'm sorry. I banged my head on the stable door when I fell, and my mind is all in a muddle. The short one is called Jason. I definitely heard the leader say his name." She looked at the sheriff hopefully, wondering whether that would help him, and then sighed with frustration at herself. "I've been racking my brains, but I can't think of anything else." "You're doing well, Mrs. Brent." Mervyn patted her arm. "Imogen is riding on Buttercup, if that means anything," Jillian offered. "At least that's one small blessing, because that horse will look after her if she manages to get away." "Wait, I've just remembered something else." Eleanor rubbed her temple, where a bruise was already blooming. When the tall man helped Imogen get onto Buttercup, his shirt cuff rose up. He has a scar on his forearm, right here. She held her arm out to show them. It looks like a zigzag shape and silvery, as though it had been done a long time ago. "That's very helpful, Mrs. Brent. I know it must be very distressing for you." The sheriff paced back and forth several steps. "It's unfortunate that what you've told me isn't ringing any bells. You don't think you might have seen them anywhere else, do you? Perhaps you've passed them on the road into town? They likely have been watching the place for a while. It's a bold move to kidnap a woman in broad daylight like this. They've probably been hiding out nearby to see who's around." Eleanor shivered at the thought of being watched without realizing it. Had they been tempted to take the children? It didn't bear thinking about. "I wish I could be more help," Jillian said, rapping her cane on the veranda floor with annoyance. "I was asleep, and they tied my wrists and then jammed a chair against my door, so I couldn't get out. I feel so useless. Poor Imogen must be terrified." "Don't upset yourself, Ma. We must be grateful they didn't hurt you, and we'll find Imogen. I'll stake my life on it." Jeff gritted his teeth and looked at the sheriff. "Are we going? This is just wasting time." Eleanor rubbed her head again and then gazed down at her arm. "That scar, I swear I've seen it before." "Can you think where?" Jeff tried to keep his voice soft. He knew she was doing her best. "It's recently, I'm sure." She screwed her eyes closed again for a moment and then clapped her hands together. "It's the man who spoke to Imogen when we were in Cottonwood Creek the other day. He was in the tea shop when we met Norma. He followed us outside and—" She stopped abruptly, looking embarrassed. "What is it?" Jeff cried. "Is it someone that Imogen knows? I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but Imogen was writing to someone else before she answered your advertisement, Jeff. But his letters stopped coming, which is why she replied to your advertisement," Eleanor added hastily. She turned toward Sheriff Reed. "If he was telling the truth, the man's name is Carl Ackhurst." Jeff clenched his fists. "Ackhurst? I know him," he growled. "I know him too." Sheriff Reed glanced at Jeff with a puzzled expression. "Who is he, and what does he want with Imogen?" Eleanor pleaded. "Tell me they won't hurt her." "I know Carl Ackhurst because he's a suspect in the stagecoach robbery I told you about. The one on the other side of Cottonwood Creek, where the driver was shot. A frown furrowed Reed's brow for a moment. Did you say his letters to your sister stopped for a while? Alina nodded. Yes, he told Imogen he'd had a fever and was very ill, and that's why he stopped writing to her. A fever, huh? Reed rolled his eyes. Carl Ackhurst is a fraudster. The reason his letters stopped is that he was in jail for forging documents. It was a petty crime and his first one, we think, so he only served a few months in jail. But then we believe he must have fallen in with this other man, Jason, who we don't know much about, robbing the stagecoach, murdering the driver, and now kidnapping Imogen. He shook his head. His crimes are getting bolder. Any reason why he might have picked on Imogen, Jeff? You say you know him? Jeff felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him as his fists bunched again. He considered for one brief moment denying his past, but then realized that if he was ever to escape from the long shadows of the way his pa had treated him, he had to be honest. Imogen's life and the success of his marriage to him depended on it. I met Carl Ackhurst in Cottonwood Creek a couple of years ago, he said slowly. I'm not the sort of man who drinks often, but on that day, something was driving me to behave out of character. There was a game of cards at the saloon, and the winner was going to get the chance to buy that block of land at the far end of my ranch. It was decided through a game of cards? Jillian sounded shocked. I'm not proud of it, Ma. I just wanted to prove to myself that I could grow High Bluff to be bigger and better than Pa ever did. He shoved his hands in his pockets and looked down. I won the game of cards and paid good money for the land. What's this got to do with why Carl has taken Imogen? Eleanor asked. Carl Ackhurst had his heart set on winning that game of cards, Jeff said with a regretful sigh. He reckoned that owning the block of land would be his new start in life. So, do you think he's held a grudge against you all this time? Sheriff Reed looked troubled. This puts a different shine on things, he muttered. I haven't thought about the man for ages. I figured he was just passing through. A drifter, a daydreamer, not someone who really wanted his own ranch. He didn't seem the type. Jeff realized with shocking clarity that he had underestimated Mr. Ackhurst. There was more to the story, but he couldn't bring himself to tell them all the details. There would be time enough for that later. Suddenly, Jeff was spurred into action. These were not just two faceless men who had kidnapped Imogen. It was personal. It was the man who had sat opposite him at the card table, swigged a glass of whiskey, and challenged him to win or walk away with nothing. Jeff knew that he couldn't let Ackhurst get away with it. I'm going to take Marty and try and find her, he said firmly. I'm coming with you, boss, Mervyn said. It's been a while, but I was a decent tracker when I was younger. The fact that it's rained recently could work in our favor if we can pick up some tracks. Sheriff Reed nodded. Do you know where they might have gone? Jeff's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the landscape again. If I were a betting man and I knew I was already wanted for robbery and murder, I'd want to stay in the backwoods. That's what I'm thinking too, Reed said. It's best if we split up. I'll head west and swing by town for a couple of trustworthy men to help me. You and Mervyn head east, but don't do anything crazy. What do you want me to do, boss? Frank asked. Stay here and guard the ranch and the women and children. Jeff turned on his heel and went into the cabin, returning a moment later with 2 rifles. He handed one to Mervyn and held the other lightly under his arm. We'll get her back, Eleanor, I promise. Without waiting for an answer, he ran toward Marty and swung himself into his saddle, with Mervyn a few paces behind. Let's go. We need to find them before daybreak. We'll start with the track to the woods on the other side of the mountain. That's where they're least likely to meet anyone, so God willing, they'll think they can escape detection going that way. Marty's muscles bunched powerfully beneath him as they launched straight into a gallop. Lord, help us find them. I can't be without my Imogen, Jeff prayed. Chapter 9. This place should do us fine to make camp for the night. Carl reined his horse to a halt and held his hand up for Jason and Imogen to be silent for a moment. He tilted his head, listening intently, but everything seemed normal. The birds were still swooping between the trees and chirping before they would roost for the night. In the distance, Some coyotes yipped and howled as they quarreled, making Imogen shiver. The thought of spending the night under the stars with wild animals prowling nearby was worrying. But then she grimaced inwardly, reminding herself that Carl and Jason probably posed far more danger to her than any coyotes. "Are you up to cooking something for us?" Jason demanded, as Imogen slithered down from Buttercup's broad back, still with her hands bound together. He grabbed the 3 horses and led them over to a grassy area that was clear of trees so that they could graze. "It always falls to me, but she may as well make herself useful. Don't you agree, Carl?" Jason grunted as he stripped the saddles from the horses and grabbed the saddlebags, which contained their supplies. "I can't do much with my wrists tied together." Imogen met Carl's cold eyes defiantly and held her arms toward him. "It's not as if I'd get far out here, is it?" she added, jerking her head toward the wilderness that surrounded them. "I have no idea where we are, so if you want me to cook for you, you're going to need to trust me, at least for an hour or 2. The corner of Carl's mouth lifted in a sneer. "Try anything stupid, and you'll regret it." He undid the tight knot and pocketed the rope, not caring as Imogen winced and rubbed her wrists, trying to ease the pain. "Make sure you stay in our sight, and you're right. We're miles from anywhere, so there's no point even thinking of trying to escape." Under Jason's watchful eye, Imogen collected firewood and brought it to the center of the clearing, where there was a small dip in the ground. In spite of the recent storm, Carl managed to coax a crackling fire into life and rolled a couple of sturdy logs toward it for them to sit on. The food supplies that Jason pulled out of his saddlebag were basic but good enough for Imogen to make a rudimentary meal of bean stew with barley and a few pieces of dried meat. It was soon bubbling in the battered tin pan suspended over the fire, sending fragrant smells into the air, and Jason nodded appreciatively as she added some wild chives that she had found growing nearby. There was a lump of stale bread to bulk the meal up, which Jason roughly sliced for her, not trusting her with his knife. "We could get used to this, don't you think?" Jason said an hour later. He leaned back against the log and belched before wiping the last of the stew from the pan with a crust of bread and chewing it loudly. "There's nothing better than a full belly and another night under the stars outrunning the law." He chuckled at his own joke and then rummaged in his saddlebag again, pulling a full bottle of whiskey out. "Well, other than a good drop of liquor, of course," he added. "Go easy on that," Carl snapped, shooting him an irritated look. "This isn't the time to relax and get sloppy. I expect Jeff's coming after us with the sheriff and a posse. Oh, stop nagging, will you?" Jason held the bottle up and looked at the amber liquid inside with reverence, the way a man might look at the woman he loved. "I've been at this game for longer than you, Carl, even though you seem to think you're in charge." He pulled the stopper out of the bottle and took a swig with a happy sigh. "Remind me, which of us was it who did time in jail because of getting caught?" he asked sarcastically, raising the bottle again in Carl's direction with a small wink. "That was just an unfortunate misunderstanding," Carl muttered. He threw a couple more pieces of wood onto the fire and folded his arms, watching as the flames took hold. His hooded eyes looked heavy with sleep, and he stifled a yawn. "Uh-huh. A misunderstanding. All criminals insist that they're innocent. Did you know that Mrs. Brookwood?" Imogen shook her head and tried to avoid his eye. She didn't want to get sucked into a conversation with them. All she wanted was to be left alone to try and figure out their weaknesses and plot her escape. "Yes, we're all innocent," Jason continued, warming to his theme. "Folks like the sheriff look down on us. But you don't have to look far to find people in high office and positions of authority who are happy enough to bend the law when it suits them." "What's wrong with working for what you want in life?" Imogen said without thinking. Jason shrugged and then tapped the side of his head. "Maybe we're smart enough not to bother with hard work to line other people's pockets. Besides, robbing isn't such a terrible crime." "I guess that's a matter of opinion." Imogen sniffed disapprovingly and struggled to her feet. Her muscles were still aching from the long ride, and she rubbed her back, feeling sore and stiff. "I'll take these to the stream and wash them," she said, starting to gather up the dirty tin plates. They had passed a small stream a couple of 100 yards before the clearing, and she wanted to fill the canteen with water and wash the plates before it was too dark. If I could just get out of their sight, maybe I could run away. The coyotes yipped and growled again, sounding closer, and she jumped nervously. "Wait," Carl roused himself. "Jason will do it," he said abruptly. "We don't want you wandering off into the night." "Whatever makes you think I would do such a thing? You seem to forget I lived in New York and Pittsburgh all my life until recently. I wouldn't last 10 minutes on my own out there in the dark." Imogen gave him an innocent smile, hoping that he would agree. "You seem like a high-spirited sort of woman with too many opinions," Carl retorted. "It makes me glad I didn't carry on writing to you, not that I could from jail." He added darkly, "It won't take me a moment. The stream is only just over there. You can see it between the trees." "I'm not taking any chances." Carl stood up, suddenly looking wide awake again. "You need to be tied up for the night, and Jason will keep watch, so don't get any ideas." He pulled the rope out of his pocket and strode over to her, tying her wrists together again. Imogen felt a chill of disappointment and fear, but didn't resist. She needed to bide her time and wait until they got careless. "Here, take this." Carl threw a thin blanket onto the ground for her, a little way away from the fire. "Lie down and go to sleep. It's a long day tomorrow, and I don't want you slowing us down." Imogen went and lay down on it with her hands tucked under the side of her head as a pillow. She was physically exhausted, but mentally her nerves were stretched practically to breaking point, and every rustle in the undergrowth seemed to get louder as darkness fell fast. She could hear Jason's grumbles as he returned from the stream and dropped a canteen of water into the dirt near her. "Thank you," she murmured before making a show of yawning so they would see how tired she was. A moment later, Jason settled himself by the fire again. "Are you going to have some of this whiskey with me?" he asked Carl. There was an edge to his voice as though the fellow outlaw's temperance annoyed him. "No, I need to keep a clear head." Imogen watched them through her almost closed eyes and strained her ears to pick up whatever she could from their conversation, which rose and fell by the fireside. She was grateful that they didn't seem worried about being overheard. Clearly, they figured they had outrun Jeff, so they talked unguardedly, and she squirreled each new piece of information away as she tried to formulate a plan of escape. "I reckon if we ride for about a week, that will get us far enough away for nobody to pay us any attention," Carl mused. "We can just lie low while we wait for Imogen's letter to reach that lawyer of hers in New York, and then for the money to be sent to her." "And after that?" Jason's eyes looked slightly out of focus as he grinned aimlessly. "Are you still hung up on buying a block of land? What if her money isn't enough for what you want?" He turned to stare at Carl, and his mood suddenly changed from jovial to sour as he swigged another mouthful of whiskey. "I suppose you think you can just get back to living a normal life after all of this, do you?" he mumbled. "A block of land is all I want, and I would have had it already if it hadn't been for Jeff Hayden taking advantage of me." Carl stared across at Imogen, and she could sense the venom in his words. It made her blood run cold. "You've gone and made everything more complicated than it needed to be by kidnapping her," Jason said sulkily. He held the whiskey bottle toward Carl and raised his eyebrows, but Carl shook his head, pushing the bottle back toward him. "What do you mean? She's worth a decent amount of money. Just because it's something different doesn't mean it won't work." "But robbing the folks on the stagecoach was easy." Jason hiccuped and laughed. "I can still remember the look on their faces and the way they squawked like a bunch of frightened chickens. Don't remind me. It would have been the perfect robbery if that fool driver hadn't tried to resist." "But we were good at it," Jason insisted. "We should have just carried on doing more robberies instead of getting tangled up in this business of kidnapping women. Reckon she'll be nothing but trouble if you ask me." "Well, I didn't ask you," Carl snapped. "This will be worth our while. Besides, you were nothing more than a pickpocket, barely making enough to buy a hot meal before we met. Robbing the stagecoach was my idea, so you should show me some respect and do as I say." "Uh-huh, and it's thanks to you we're being hunted for a murder charge after you shot the stagecoach driver." Jason harumphed and turned his head obstinately away, feeling disgruntled. Carl murdered an innocent man? Imogen shivered, and it took all her willpower to stay still, pretending to be asleep. She heard the whiskey slosh in the bottle again as Jason took another swig, and she wished that Carl would have some too. If their senses were blunted by the strong liquor, she might have a chance to escape during the night while they were asleep. She opened her eyes a chink and moved her head very slightly to check where the horses were. Relief washed through her as she saw that they were still standing patiently at the edge of the clearing, their heads low as they dozed. She had been worried that Jason might hobble the horses, but he hadn't. The only way for her to escape would be on Buttercup. If she walked, she wouldn't be able to cover enough distance, and they would catch me again. She just had to pray that they fall asleep, so she could get to Buttercup and slip away without them hearing her. "I still think we should just ditch her and go back to plain old robberies," Jason slurred. He was getting riled up, and he thrust his face toward Carl aggressively, brandishing the bottle of whiskey and slopping some onto the ground between them. "Taking her will just draw more attention to us. Why were you so set on doing it anyway?" "Because I want Jeff Hayden to suffer," Carl yelled, losing his patience. He lunged forward and grabbed the whiskey bottle from Jason, tipping it up and taking a long gulp. Taking her was the best way to get back at him. He coughed as the liquor burned his throat, and then he dragged the back of his hand across his mouth before taking another swig. "But what if she doesn't do as she's told? What if she gets us caught and thrown in jail, or worse? All that just to get your own back on some fancy rancher." As quick as a striking snake, Carl leaned over and put his hand around Jason's neck, squeezing it until the man's eyes bulged with fear. "I want Jeff Hayden to understand what it's like to lose something precious like I had to," he said softly. "Don't question me again, otherwise I'll make sure the crows are picking over your bones by sunrise. Is that clear?" "All right, there's no need to get mad," Jason croaked huffily as Carl released him. "You know best." He shuffled further away and lay down in the dirt next to the fire with a loud sigh. "Don't forget you're keeping watch," Carl said firmly. He tipped another generous slug of whiskey into his mouth and gazed into the flames. "You sleep for an hour, and then we'll swap." "Sure, and I won't let you down," Jason mumbled, eager to get back onto a friendlier footing. Thinking about it, this was a good idea. She seems like a pampered sort of woman who's probably scared of her own shadow, so she's bound to do what we want. I'm glad you've gotten the good sense to come around to my way of thinking. Carl grinned to himself and drained the last few mouthfuls of whiskey from the bottle before shuffling closer to the fire to throw another log onto it. With one last glance in Imogen's direction to satisfy himself that she was asleep, he yawned and stretched out on his back. He wriggled to make himself comfortable and covered his face with his hat. Imogen's mind raced as the minutes ticked by. The good thing was that both men had a bellyful of whiskey, which might work in her favor. But the bad thing, she now realized, was the level of hatred Carl seemed to have for Jeff. He had promised that they would let her go as soon as the money had come through, but now she was full of doubts. Even though she had no idea what Jeff had done to anger Carl in the past, she was coming to realize that Carl was a man with a grudge who thought nothing of using violence to get his way. Will he really let me walk away at the end of this? If Sheriff Reed and Jeff catch up, Carl would probably rather shoot me dead than let me go. Her thoughts were chilling, but one thing had become crystal clear. Imogen had to try to escape within the next few hours. If she left it any longer, it would be too late. She surreptitiously moved her hands out from under her head and started working at the knotted rope around her wrists with her teeth. There was a tiny bit of give in the rope, which was enough to give her hope. She would free herself. She was determined to. Imogen slowly sat up, taking care not to make the slightest sound, and unwound the rope from her wrists. By her reckoning, both of the men had been fast asleep for at least an hour. It seemed that the whiskey had done the trick, and their deep rumbling snores had filled the air minutes after they had both settled down. Wispy clouds scudded over a half moon, giving just enough silvery light for her to see where the horses were. The flames of the fire had died down, leaving just glowing embers, and she carefully got to her feet. She paused for a moment, watching Carl and Jason, but they lay there completely still, rhythmically snoring. One step at a time, she edged away from the camp, holding her skirts up so she could place her feet on the soft grass and be sure to avoid any twigs that might snap. When she reached the horses, she saw Buttercup's ears flick forward. She prayed the horses would stay quiet and quickly lifted her hand to stroke Buttercup's neck to reassure her that everything was all right. Her saddle was still near the fire, so she was going to need to ride bareback. Holding her breath, she gathered the reins in her hands and walked the horse toward a fallen log that she had spotted earlier. She grabbed Buttercup's mane to steady herself and climbed awkwardly onto the log, hitched up her skirts, and threw her leg over the mare's broad back. Buttercup shifted underneath her, startled by the way Imogen's dress flapped over her rump, and for one awful moment, Imogen thought she might rear up and throw her off. Imogen quickly leaned over the horse's neck and stroked her soothingly. "Sorry, Buttercup. We need to work together if we're going to get home again. I'm putting all my trust in you." The other two horses fidgeted uneasily behind her, throwing their heads in alarm, and Imogen knew it was now or never. She squeezed her legs, and Buttercup obligingly walked forward, picking up the same path that they had arrived on. "I don't know if this is going to take us home, but we have to try," Imogen murmured. She glanced back over her shoulder, terrified that she would see Carl and Jason leaping up from their slumbers to chase after her, and was relieved to see that they hadn't moved. She squeezed her legs a bit tighter. "Let's go, girl," she whispered, urging Buttercup into a trot and then a slow lope. Branches whipped across them, snatching at her dress and scratching her arms, but she didn't care. By the time they came to the edge of the woodland, the first pearly pink wash of dawn was starting to lighten the sky in the east. Imogen had no idea where she was in this vast landscape of mountains and pastures. She couldn't see a single dwelling or even a sign of stock fencing, but desperation drove her forward. Now that it was getting light, it was even more imperative that she put some distance between herself and the two outlaws. She could only imagine the rage they would feel when they woke up to discover she had escaped, and what they would be prepared to do to capture her again. They settled into a steady pace, and before long, the sun crested the mountaintops, and she felt its warmth hit her face. Suddenly, she became aware of a new sound, a low roaring and rumbling. She urged the mare forward up the hill, and when they came to the brow, she looked down to see a river snaking through the grassland in front of them. Her throat was parched, and it felt like a long time since the tepid drink of water she'd had from the canteen the night before. It was tempting to get off and have a long, cool drink, but there was no time to waste. They were out in the open, and the men might be chasing her already. "If we cross the river, they might lose our tracks," she said, thinking out loud. Buttercup's ears flickered as they approached the water's edge. There was no way of telling how deep the river was, and Imogen wondered whether she was about to make a terrible mistake. "She's a good mare. She'll always look after you." That's what Jeff had said to her when he'd first saddled the mare up for her to learn to ride in the corral. She prayed that it was true, and felt a surge of longing to see his strong, rugged face again. "You choose the path across, Buttercup," she said, patting the horse's neck. She let the reins hang slack and loosened the grip of her legs, letting her feet dangle down, hoping that the horse would understand what she wanted her to do. Buttercup tossed her head, rippling her mane, and hesitantly stepped forward into the water. Prayer was all that Imogen could put her faith into, so she glanced up to the clear blue sky and uttered a heartfelt plea. "Lord, please help us. We put ourselves in your hands and trust that whatever the outcome of today is, you will take care of us, as your Son, our Savior, cared for those in need." The swirling water rose higher and higher up Buttercup's legs as they slowly forded the river, and the coldness of it made Imogen gasp as her feet got wet. She thought back to the wild storm and torrential rain of just a few days before and wondered whether they might get swept away. One unexpected stumble was all it would take for the horse to lose her footing. "Come on, girl. You can do it. Take us home, Buttercup," Just when it felt as though Buttercup might lose her nerve, the brave mare seemed to gather herself beneath Imogen, and with one last burst of effort, carried her across the last few yards of water and scrambled out onto the opposite riverbank. A pathway followed the river, and with a sigh of relief, Imogen gave Buttercup her head again, and they set off. All she could do was hang on and pray that they might meet a kind-hearted stranger who would help them. Chapter 10. "It's no good, boss," Mervyn said, sounding annoyed with himself. Whether it was deliberate or not, they must have taken a route through the fields where the cattle were grazing, which means the ground is too churned up for me to pick up their tracks again. Jeff swiveled in his saddle to look for clues of where the outlaws had taken Imogen and lowered his hat against the glare of the sun rising over the mountains. They had ridden hard the previous evening, sweeping methodically backward and forward over the hills with no luck. Even though he'd wanted to carry on looking during the night with every fiber of his being, he knew it would be a fool's errand. Instead, they had returned to the ranch, so the horses would be fresh to ride again at dawn. He had barely slept a wink, but the plan had paid off when Mervyn spotted their tracks at daybreak. 3 sets of horses. Hoofprints at the far side of some scrubby grassland. They had dismissed that route yesterday, thinking it was too obvious and too close to the homestead, but the evidence was plain to see. "We can't give up just because we've lost the tracks," Jeff said tersely. He sniffed the air like a dog in the hope that he might smell a hint of smoke from a campfire. But there was nothing. "We need to think this through," Mervyn said slowly. He thumbed his hat back and scratched his head. "Maybe they've used the river to throw us off the scent?" "I'm not so sure," Jeff muttered. "After that storm, do you think they would risk it? It would take a brave man to consider riding through the river when it's in full spate. Or a foolish one who doesn't understand the land." Mervyn raised his eyebrows questioningly and looked toward the mountains. Even from this distance, he could hear the faint roar of the water tumbling down the mountainside. "I think we should check, even if it's just to rule it out." Jeff lifted his reins and nodded. Anything was better than standing idly by, wondering where on earth they had gotten to. He nudged Marty with his heels, and the gelding surged forward, eager to please his master. Within half an hour, they had left the fenced fields of High Bluff Ranch, and they were loping slowly through scrubby, untamed land. The main river, which snaked away into the distance, was a raging torrent that no man in his right mind would have attempted to cross, even on horseback. But Mervyn pointed out the smaller tributary, which could have been passable in the right place with care, and they headed toward it. They leaned back on their horses, letting the animals pick their route down the steep bank. Look there." Mervyn stood up in his stirrups a moment later, with a note of excitement in his voice, pointing ahead. "There are tracks on the path next to the river, and it looks to me like it's just one horse. You think she could have escaped?" Jeff's heart surged with hope for the first time, but it was short-lived as he looked at the rugged terrain. "She isn't that good a rider," he said, feeling a stab of worry. "If her hands are tied together and Buttercup stumbles on this rough ground, she could fall off and hit her head on a rock. Or she could have already fallen off in the river and drowned, just like what happened to Pa. Her body swept away already, and we'll never know." The terrifying thoughts swirled through his mind, but he refused to speak them out loud. "If there is one thing I know about Buttercup, it's that she will look after Imogen. Besides, who else would be riding this path after a storm? Someone desperate, that's who." Mervyn shot him a reassuring smile. "You're right. This wouldn't be the sort of route a trapper would take." With a flick of his hand, Jeff wheeled Marty around, and they picked their way along the riverside as fast as they could safely do so. What if it's not her, and we're just wasting time? They could be miles away by now. Jeff gritted his teeth and pushed the next lot of unwelcome thoughts away. He had to hang on to this shred of hope. It had gotten to the point where he didn't even care about capturing Carl and Jason as long as Imogen was safe and he could take her home. A sudden flicker of movement in the willow trees ahead caught his eye, making his breath catch in his throat. "There, I think you're right, Mervyn." "Uh-huh. I saw it too. We just have to pray she doesn't think we're the outlaws coming after her," which might make her panic. Throwing caution to the wind, Jeff spurred Marty into a gallop, trusting that the horse wouldn't let him down. "Imogen, stop! It's us!" He saw Imogen glance over her shoulder with a terrified expression and thump Buttercup's flanks with her heels to make the mare go faster. It was exactly what he had feared, and he leaned forward over Marty's neck, urging him to get closer. "Imogen!" he yelled again. His voice was practically drowned out by the sound of the rushing river. He had to do something different. "Buttercup, steady girl, slow down." Marty's nostrils flared, and his neck was slick with sweat. But just as Buttercup reached a dangerously rocky part of the path, the gelding gave a shrill whinny, and the mare's head jerked upward as she recognized the noise. "That's it, girl," Jeff cried. "Whoa there, Buttercup," he shouted again. This time his voice echoed off the steep bank on the other side of the river, and he saw the mare come to a juddering halt just in front of him. He vaulted off Marty's back, stumbling on the rough ground, and then ran forward. "Imogen, it's me. You can stop now." He reached Imogen's side just in time to catch her as she slid off Buttercup, practically collapsing in his arms. "Jeff, oh Jeff, my love." Her words were a mixture of laughter and tears of happiness. "I thought you were Carl and Jason. Buttercup has looked after me so well, but I thought my time was up. I'm sorry I didn't stop sooner," she sobbed. Suddenly, the shock of everything overwhelmed her, and she started trembling within the protective circle of his arms. Jeff pulled her closer and stroked her back gently. "It's all right now, Imogen. You're safe, and I promise I'll never let you come to any harm again." She tilted her head to look into his eyes, and his heart squeezed with pure relief that they had gotten to her before Carl Ackhurst and his vile associate. "I was scared I might never see you again," she murmured. Her sobs subsided, leaving tears glittering like diamonds on her eyelashes, and he gently brushed his thumbs over her tear-stained cheeks, bringing a tremulous smile to her face. "We would never have given up on you," he murmured. "I reckon they'll be raging like wounded bulls when they see you've escaped," Mervyn said cheerfully, bringing some much-needed humor to the moment. "Yes, it looks like they picked the wrong woman when they chose you," Jeff said with a chuckle. "What's going to happen now?" Imogen asked. "We'll ride back to the homestead, and then Sheriff Reed and his posse will hunt them down." Jeff was surprised to see Imogen frown and shake her head. "They'll be long gone by then," she said quickly. "I can lead you straight to them. It's not that far. Plus, if we go now, we'll have the element of surprise." "I don't think that's a good idea," Jeff said firmly. The urge to protect Imogen was overpowering, and he wanted her as far away as possible from Carl and Jason. There was no knowing how the men might react now that they had lost their hostage, but he was willing to bet they wouldn't go meekly. "That's just the thing. They won't expect you to come after them straight away. They think I'm a pampered little woman, and they will expect you to take me back to the homestead to recover." "She's got a point," Mervyn said, nodding thoughtfully. "It would take us a while to get news to Reed. Do you really think you can remember your way back?" "I sure do." Imogen tilted her chin with a determined glint in her eye. "It's through the river, just down yonder, and then the other side of that rise in the woods. It shouldn't take us long. The amount of whiskey they drank last night, they're probably feeling pretty groggy." Jeff hesitated, weighing up his desire to see the men brought to justice against wanting to take Imogen back to the safety of the homestead. "As long as you promise to stay behind us," he said eventually, with a wry smile. "Mervyn and I can handle them, but I can't be held accountable for my actions if they try and hurt you again." "Why did you let her go, you fool?" "That's right, blame it all on me. It was your crazy idea to kidnap her in the first place. I never wanted to be any part of it." The sudden eruption of Carl and Jason's angry shouts up ahead sent the birds clattering into the sky in alarm. Jeff held up his hand so that Mervyn and Imogen would stop behind him and cocked his head to one side, trying to pinpoint exactly where the men were. "You were meant to be keeping watch. I told you not to drink so much whiskey. What about you? The bottle is empty, and I swear I only had half. You're not as pure as you want everyone to believe you are, Carl. You had just as much to drink as I did. It's not my fault we both fell asleep." Jeff and Mervyn dismounted silently and handed their reins to Imogen. The dappled shade of the trees provided good camouflage, and Jeff held her gaze for a brief moment. "Stay here and leave it to us," he murmured in a low voice. "It will all be over in a few minutes." As the two of them approached the camp, the sound of arguing abruptly stopped. It was replaced by grunts and the clatter of tin plates, making Jeff chuckle inwardly to himself. The two outlaws had fallen out and were settling their differences in a fight, which was perfect for them to sneak up to the camp without being noticed. Mervyn looked at Jeff and raised his eyebrows, pointing toward a large tree. At Jeff's nod, he slipped quietly away, positioning himself behind the tree trunk so they had a clear sight of the brawling thugs rolling around in the dirt from two different angles. Working as one, Jeff and Mervyn lifted their rifles and fired 2 shots, which whistled overhead. "What?" "Run!" Carl and Jason hollered in shock and rage from where they were lying in a tangle of limbs in the middle of their fistfight. "Don't even think about reaching for your guns or trying to get away," Jeff growled as he strode into the clearing, raising his gun again. "No, don't shoot again," Jason spluttered. He held his hands up, giving Jeff a pleading smile. "We didn't mean any harm by taking your woman. Anyway, it was all his idea." His gaze slid toward Carl, and he licked his lips nervously. "You have to understand, I'm not really part of this. I'm just a small-town pickpocket who got sucked into something by accident." Carl gave his companion a scornful look and rolled his eyes. "I always knew you were a coward." He glared up at Jeff. "I suppose the game's up then, is it?" he said, sounding unremorseful. "It sure is. Roll on your belly and put your hands behind your back. Mervyn's going to tie you up, and we should have you delivered into the care of Sheriff Reed within no time. You might think you've beaten us, but I'll find a way to get my own back, even if it takes me the rest of my life." Carl spat in the dirt by Jeff's boots before reluctantly rolling over. "What kind of a snake kidnaps an innocent woman?" Mervyn said, shaking his head. "By the time your murder of that poor stagecoach driver is taken into account as well, you'll be lucky to get away with 25 years breaking rocks." He lashed a rope around Carl's wrists, knotting it tightly before hauling him to his feet. "An innocent woman? If that's what you think she is, you're in for trouble," Carl said, directing a bitter laugh at Jeff. "I've never heard someone so full of opinions. You'll have a lifetime of having to suffer listening to her when you get married." Jeff took a deep breath, not rising to the bait. "You fancied yourself as a man of the land, but all you did was travel in a big circle. My homestead is just over yonder hill. I guess you got lost." "What?" Jason scowled at Carl. "I thought you said you knew these backwoods? Well, if it was up to you, we'd still be dipping into people's pockets for a few cents. This was our chance to make proper money." Jason shook his head, looking incredulous. Now that Carl was tied up, he could afford to speak his mind. "How did you imagine you could run your own ranch if you can't even pick an escape route through the woods? What sort of fool are you, leading us straight back to Mr. Hayden's place? It was dark." Now, that's enough squabbling, gentlemen," Mervyn said with a burst of laughter. "It seems you underestimated Mrs. Brookwood, so you owe her an apology and then some." "I'm not apologizing," Carl retorted, looking outraged. He stumbled along the path as Mervyn prodded him in the back. "You brought this upon yourself, Jeff. You should have let me win that game of cards, and we could have rubbed along as neighbors instead of me having to resort to this. You stole my future from me." Jeff felt a pang of guilt and turned to face Carl. "Do you know what? I've thought a lot about that game of cards, and for a long time I felt guilty for what I did. If this had been your only crime, I might even have asked Sheriff Reed to treat you with leniency. But you shot that stagecoach driver in cold blood just to steal a few pieces of jewelry from those poor, terrified travelers. You turned to a life of crime, and that's on your conscience, not mine. Will you put in a good word for me?" Jason pleaded. "Robbing the stagecoach wasn't my idea either," he added hopefully. "That's not for me to decide." Jeff heaved them up onto their horses, checking they couldn't escape, and took hold of the reins. "Sheriff Reed will keep you in jail until the traveling judge comes to Willow Brook, and then you must answer for your crimes." The sound of Carl and Jason's bickering filled the air again, and Jeff shook his head in exasperation. It was going to be a long day, But at least his darling Imogen was safe, and that was what mattered more than anything. Chapter 11. "That was a good day's work," Sheriff Reed said as he bundled the two outlaws toward his wagon. "We have you to thank for that, Mrs. Brookwood," he added, tipping his hat politely. "Thanks to your bravery, I don't think these two will be bothering the good people of Montana again." Jeff felt a sense of relief as they watched the sheriff and his deputy depart for Willow Brook down the track. The men had been tied up under a tree at the edge of the barnyard for the last couple of hours, with Frank keeping watch, and Jason had soon crumbled, pleading for a chance to make amends. "I'm glad Jason had the decency to apologize to your ma and Eleanor," Imogen said. "I know it's not much, but he soon lost his bluster once you caught him. I could almost feel sorry for him." "He's just trying to get an easy ride with the sheriff, probably," Jeff replied. "Don't forget they murdered a man." Carl had behaved very differently, stubbornly turning his face the other way, refusing to show any remorse whatsoever. Jeff couldn't help but wonder whether it was because he couldn't bear to lose yet again. "Well, I'm glad to see the back of them." Imogen shivered in spite of the heat. They were standing together on the veranda, and she picked up the wicker basket she used for taking the laundry to the line before turning to go back inside. "I guess I'd better make a start on preparing dinner. Doing ordinary things again will help me forget about what happened." Jeff knew that if he didn't take this opportunity to be completely honest with Imogen, it might cast a shadow over their marriage forever. "Will you walk with me in the garden for a few minutes?" he asked. "There's something I need to explain to you." Imogen hesitated for a beat and then nodded, putting the basket down again. "You don't have to tell me anymore unless you really want to, but a walk in the garden with you will be wonderful. Dinner can wait a few minutes longer." She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. Now it was Jeff's turn to hesitate. What if she doesn't love me anymore when she finds out the real reason why Carl came here? He felt a prickle of worry at the thought, but pushed it away. "It's important. I don't want there ever to be any secrets between us." The hum of bees drifting between the flowers was a soothing counterpoint to the danger and violence of the morning, and it helped remind Jeff that they could find a way back to living a peaceful, normal life. "A few years ago, I was a hungry, ambitious man," he started hesitantly. "I never really knew what drove me, but now, looking back, I realize it was because I wanted to prove to myself that I could be a better man than my pa. And you are. I can see that you're kind-hearted and a good son to Jillian." Imogen trailed her fingers through the flowers and then bent over to pull up some weeds that she had missed the last time she was gardening. The vegetable patch just beyond the flowers was already looking abundant with corn, beans, and squash, and the apple trees were laden with fruit. Jillian had promised she would show her how to preserve the bountiful harvest to last them through the long, snowy winter, and she was looking forward to learning from her. "I rarely drink now," Jeff continued. "But back then, I was in the saloon, having a couple of drinks one day. There was a card game about to start, and whoever won it was going to get the opportunity to buy the block of land on the edge of this ranch's boundary. The previous owner was selling it. I never met the man, as he lived back east and owned the land as an investment. He must have had a strange sense of humor to make the sale hang on a card game, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to own that land, but so did Carl Ackhurst. I could tell from his demeanor that he seemed pretty desperate. But if the cards were dealt fairly, surely you won by pure luck." Imogen looked puzzled. "Why would Carl hold a grudge against you for all this time?" Jeff looked down at his boots and then at the horizon, not quite able to meet her kind hazel eyes. Carl was drinking heavily. If I'd been a better sort of man, I would have insisted that the card game stopped and that we should only play when we were sober. I guess I knew he wasn't playing in full possession of his senses. Looking back, I'm ashamed to say that I took advantage of him. He sighed, knowing he couldn't take his words back again now. "It's not something I'm proud of. I really want you to know that, Imogen." A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, lifting the curls on the nape of her neck. And Jeff slowly met her gaze, expecting to see disappointment. But instead, she reached out and held his hands in hers, smiling softly. You can't change the past, Jeff. But with God's mercy, perhaps you can find a way to make amends in some other way. Carl might have lost the chance to buy that land, but he made the choice to rob the stagecoach and shoot the driver. He could have taken a more honest path in life, so you can't blame yourself for everything that he did since that card game. Jeff's heart soared with sudden joy. If Imogen could forgive him and he could find a way to make some good from his past, he would be a happy man. That's why I wanted to become mayor of Willow Brook, he explained. I never told anyone this, but it was my dream to use some of the profits I make from that block of land to improve the town, to benefit the children of Willow Brook and help the poor and needy. You are a truly wonderful man, Jeff, Imogen said with a twinkle in her eyes. It's time to put the past behind us. I reckon that together we'll be able to achieve a lot, don't you? I sure do, Jeff said. He chuckled as he remembered how shocked Carl and Jason had been to realize Imogen had outwitted them. First, we have our wedding, and then we have the rest of our lives to live together and serve our community. He brushed a kiss on her cheek, looking forward to being able to call her his wife, and she turned her face, so their lips met in a dizzying moment of passion. I love you so much, Imogen said, giving him a heartfelt smile as they broke apart again. They held hands and started walking back toward the cabin. I love you, too, and I'll always be grateful it was you who replied to my advertisement. I truly believe that the Lord wanted us to be together. There was a sudden commotion in the barnyard, and Isaac and Lily came running toward them. Can you tell us about how you managed to capture the outlaws, Uncle Jeff? They cried excitedly. Ma just told us they're in a whole heap of trouble. Jeff grinned and reached down to swing Lily high into the air, making her giggle. It was all down to your Aunt Imogen, he began. Epilogue. High Bluff Ranch, Willow Brook, 1 year later. I'm not sure I'll ever get used to having to wear a tie, Jeff grumbled, running his finger around his collar. He paced back and forth in the living room, muttering snatches of his speech under his breath. Ladies and gentlemen, this heralds a wonderful new opportunity for the children of Willow Brook. That's because you're a rancher, born and bred, Imogen said with a chuckle. She held the frock coat up for him, and he slid his arms into it. Even though she knew he didn't like wearing fancy clothes, he had to do so now and again in his role as the mayor of Willow Brook. She walked around to stand in front of him and did the mother-of-pearl buttons up and straightened his tie before standing back to admire the look. His broad shoulders and tousled brown hair set her heart racing as always. He looked handsome in the fine clothes. But she loved him no less when he was wearing one of his old shirts and covered in dust after a hard day working out in the fields. You look very beautiful, Jeff said. His admiring glance at her pale blue gown and dark ringlets brought a flush of warmth to Imogen's cheeks. Thank you, she said, feeling suddenly shy. It's a special celebration, so I wanted to look the part. It's not every day my dear husband gives a speech to the whole of Willow Brook for the grand opening of the new school. She caught their reflection in the mirror, still feeling the familiar spark of joy that they were married. It had been a year since the pastor had declared them man and wife, but it still felt like yesterday. I reckon we're about ready to go, Jeff said. Mervin's gotten the wagon ready for us. He slipped his arm around Imogen's waist and pulled her close. May I escort you into Willow Brook, Mrs. Hayden? He asked with a twinkle in his eye. Aren't you forgetting something? She arched her eyebrows and gave him a wry smile. Or should I say, someone? Of course not, he exclaimed. He tiptoed to the corner of the room and paused next to the crib he had carved during the dark winter evenings. Imogen followed him and they stood side by side, gazing down at their baby boy. I still have to pinch myself, Jeff said softly. I never thought I'd be a pa, but now I can't imagine life without little Jessie, can you? Imogen nodded in agreement. It truly was a blessing that we have our own baby, a son to follow in your footsteps. She leaned over the crib and picked Jessie up, settling him in the crook of her arm. His dark eyes looked inquisitively around, and Jeff gently stroked the downy brown hair on his head with a look of awe on his face. You'll be the best pa for Jessie, She rocked him gently, and he gave them both a gummy smile that melted her heart. "I'm sure you're probably already counting the days until you can start teaching him to ride and taking him out on the ranch with you," she said teasingly. "You bet I am," Jeff laughed. "I enjoy it," he added, nodding as he realized it was true. Teaching Isaac and Lily about raising cattle and working with animals while Eleanor has been here this last year has shown me that I'm not the same as my father was. He never had the patience for it, but I find it rewarding. Imogen turned her face upward, and their lips met in a tender kiss that made her heart skip a beat. "I always knew you were a kind-hearted man, no matter what you thought of yourself, after all that business with Carl and the game of cards. That's why you make such a wonderful mayor, and the townsfolk think so highly of you. It's hard to believe a year has passed already since Carl and Jason kidnapped you." Jeff ushered Imogen out onto the veranda. "Anyway, we've put all that behind us now. Thank the Lord that they'll be in jail for a very long time, and you and Ma and Eleanor were none the worse for their crazy plan." They stood together on the veranda for a moment, sharing a quiet moment before the busy day ahead. Across the barnyard, Eleanor was already sitting in the wagon with Isaac and Lily, ready to go into town. Mervyn and Frank were laughing loudly at the antics of a young colt they were working with in the corral. And behind the homestead, Jillian was sitting on the seat in their newly built rose arbor, enjoying the view over the rolling hills toward the mountains. Imogen felt a sense of peace and contentment flow through her. She had everything she had ever wished for. The sense of love between her and Jeff grew deeper and stronger with each day that passed, and her prayers had been answered for a baby of their own. "What time is the grand opening, boss?" Mervyn hollered, snapping Imogen out of her reverie. He let himself out of the corral and walked toward them. "Frank's going to stay here and look after things, but I figured I would ride into town and come to the celebration." "We're leaving now," Jeff said. "And of course, you must come, seeing as how you gave us so much help raising the new school building. There's going to be a tea party afterward, and Abraham and Fiona are providing all the cakes." Imogen adjusted her bonnet and shifted Jessie to her other arm. "Guess I'd better have a wash and saddle up my horse then," Mervyn said with a grin. "Norma told me she'll be there," Imogen added with a mischievous smile. Jeff chuckled as they saw Mervyn turn red as he hurried away. "I'm not sure if those two are going to end up courting, but Norma certainly seems to have taken a shine to Mervyn." "I don't know either, but they enjoy each other's company, which makes me happy." Imogen thought fondly of her friend and their loyal ranch hand. Who knew what the future might hold for them? "I love you, Imogen," Jeff said. He put his arm around her shoulder and brushed another kiss on her lips. "You make everything complete." "Well, there's nowhere I would rather be than living at High Bluff Ranch with you and our son, my love." They walked down the steps toward the wagon where the others were waiting, and Imogen smiled to herself. This was her home now, and she was blessed to have good friends and a family she adored. Life was good, and she gave thanks for her blessings every day. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean, romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.